2 weeks after my daughter's engagement party, the event coordinator called me. She told me she had recorded something terrible. She instructed me to come alone and not tell my daughter. The audio clip she played for me changed everything in my life. I am Lawrence. I am 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the dirt up. As the founder of a major logistics firm, I am used to navigating treacherous roads, but I never expected the sharpest curve to come from within my own family. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect what you built from those trying to tear it down. I was sitting in my corporate office that Tuesday afternoon reviewing the quarterly maintenance logs for my trucking fleet. The heavy hum of diesel engines from the loading docks below was the soundtrack of my life. It was a comforting rhythm, a reminder of the empire I had built through 30 years of hauling steel and driving concrete trucks. The polished mahogany of my desk felt cold under my calloused hands that had earned every dollar in my bank accounts. My desk phone rang, cutting through the low rumble of the yard. I picked it up, expecting a dispatch report. Instead, I heard the voice of Valerie, the coordinator for my daughter Naomi's engagement party. She did not sound like her usual composed professional self. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Lawrence," she said, her words rushing out in a frantic whisper. "I need you to come to my studio right now. Please come alone." I asked her what was wrong, assuming a vendor issue or a billing discrepancy. "I found something. I recorded something at the party. It is terrible, sir. You need to hear it. Do not tell Naomi." The urgency in her tone sent a sharp, unfamiliar spike of adrenaline through my chest. I did not ask any more questions. I grabbed my keys, walked out of my office, and drove straight to her studio across town. The drive felt endless, a rising tide of unease pooling in my stomach. When I arrived, Valerie locked the door behind me and pulled the blinds shut. She looked terrified, her hands shaking as she held out a small digital audio recorder. "I left this running in the VIP coat room by accident," she explained, her eyes darting away from mine. "I was recording notes for the floral arrangements and forgot to turn it off. I was reviewing the files this morning. You need to hear what was said." She pressed play and pushed the device across her desk. The audio was clear. I recognized the arrogant, drawling voice immediately. It was Garrison Pierce, the father of my future son-in-law, Logan. The sound of clinking ice against crystal echoed through the recording. He was drinking my 50-year-old scotch. "Can you believe this place?" Garrison laughed, a wet, mocking sound. "The whole estate looks like a testament to the ghetto lottery. All this wealth, and he still carries himself like a day laborer." My jaw tightened, but I remained silent, letting the recording continue. I heard Logan's voice next, smooth and calculating, the exact voice he used to charm my daughter. "Relax, Dad," Logan said. "Just tolerate the man for a few more months. Marrying Naomi is strictly a corporate acquisition." Garrison sighed heavily. "I hope you know what you are doing, son. The federal auditors are closing in. We are out of time." Logan chuckled, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "I have it completely handled. Naomi is incredibly easy to manage. Once we are married, I will integrate his clean logistics company into our portfolio. We will use his immaculate credit and his cash reserves to absorb our debts. We will liquidate his fleet if we have to. We will be clear of the bankruptcy and the feds before the end of the fiscal year." The recording clicked off. The silence in Valerie's office was absolute. I looked down at my hands, the scars across my knuckles, the permanent stiffness in my right wrist from a crushed steel beam 20 years ago. I had bled on the asphalt to ensure my family never went hungry. I had fought through systemic barriers, redlining, and countless banks refusing to lend to a young African-American man trying to buy a used freight truck. I built a fortress so my daughter would never know the cold bite of poverty. And now a manicured boy with a fake trust fund was planning to steal it all to save his corrupt, ruined family. I did not yell. I did not smash the recorder against the wall, though every instinct demanded I do so. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight, my face entirely impassive. I thanked Valerie for her integrity and walked out of her studio. I drove back to my office, my mind operating with total lethal clarity. I did not call Naomi. I needed facts, not emotions. I needed to see how far Logan had already moved his pieces on the board. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I logged into my company's secondary banking portal to check the wedding escrow account, a substantial fund I had set aside to cover the lavish ceremony Logan had insisted upon. I typed in my credentials. A red banner flashed across the screen. "Access denied. The password has been changed." I gripped the steering wheel of my truck so hard my knuckles ached, the leather warm beneath my palms. The drive from the event coordinator's studio to the central downtown bank took exactly 14 minutes, but my mind raced through decades of meticulous planning and hard-won victories. I pulled into the loading zone through the heavy transmission into park and completely ignored the valet approaching my door. I strode through the thick glass doors of the bank, the cool air conditioning doing absolutely nothing to lower the temperature of my blood. The polished marble floors echoed under my heavy work boots as I bypassed the long line of patrons and the velvet ropes. The tellers looked up their polite corporate greetings dying in their throats when they saw the dark expression on my face. I did not stop or offer explanations. I walked directly to the heavy oak door of the branch manager's office and pushed it open without knocking. Mr. Higgins looked up from his dual monitors, his silver spectacles slipping down his nose in shock. He started to protest the sudden intrusion, but my absolute silence shut him down instantly. I stood directly in front of his desk and demanded the immediate status of my company's wedding escrow account. Higgins swallowed hard, his fingers trembling over his keyboard. He pulled up the file, his face quickly draining of color. He looked at me terrified and stammered that a major administrative change had been processed just yesterday morning. My daughter Naomi, acting under the broad permissions I had granted her for the wedding preparations, had officially authorized Logan Pierce as a joint signer on the account. The sheer arrogance of the move was staggering. Logan had not wasted a single minute playing the devoted fiancé. He had secured the keys to the vault before the ink on the engagement party invitations was even dry. I leaned my heavy frame over Higgins's desk, demanding to see the transaction history for the past 24 hours. He nervously turned the monitor toward me, his hands shaking so visibly that the computer mouse rattled against the polished wood. There it was, displayed in stark red digital ink. Less than an hour ago, Logan had initiated a massive expedited wire transfer. $300,000 was currently pending clearance, moving directly from the escrow account into a shielded offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was not a deposit for a premium florist or a luxury caterer. It was a blatant, calculated bleed of my capital. I stared at the numbers on the screen, visualizing the hundreds of hours I had spent breathing in diesel fumes, repairing broken axles in the dead of winter, and pouring concrete to earn that money. Logan intended to wipe it out with the simple click of a button to quietly cover his father's fraudulent debts. I looked Higgins dead in the eye and ordered him to cancel the wire immediately. I instructed him to invoke my Supreme Founder Override Clause, a strict security protocol written into the very bedrock of the corporate charter when I established the firm's primary financial trust. It granted me the absolute authority to unilaterally freeze all subsidiary accounts in the event of suspected fraud. I told him to lock the escrow account, sever all digital access immediately, and flag Logan Pierce's credentials for unauthorized access. Higgins hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass door. The pending transfer was routed to an entity linked to Garrison Pierce, a man whose old money family name carried significant, albeit unearned, weight in the local financial sector. Higgins mumbled a pathetic excuse about banking regulations, joint signer protocols, and the potential legal complications of reversing a dual authorized transfer linked to the prestigious Pierce family. He was paralyzed by the fear of offending a powerful white dynasty, completely forgetting who held the actual liquid wealth sitting in his vaults. He tried to offer a cowardly compromise, suggesting we wait for standard clearance procedures to investigate the matter through official channels. The audacity of his hesitation fueled the quiet, burning fury inside me. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden drop in my tone commanded the immense gravity of the room. I leaned closer, resting my scarred knuckles on his pristine desk calendar. I reminded Higgins that 40 years ago I walked into this exact building covered in motor grease and construction dust. I was a young African-American man holding $50 and a business plan written on a cheap legal pad. Every single bank in this city had laughed me out of their lobbies, refusing to lend a single dime to a man who looked like me trying to buy his first used freight truck. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from that single $50 deposit, without a handout, without a secret trust fund, and without a famous last name to force open doors. I told him that my sweat built the financial foundations of this very branch, and I would not allow an entitled bankrupt boy to steal my legacy while a cowardly bank manager worried about high society politics. I tapped the mahogany desk once. I ordered him to freeze the money right now, or I would withdraw my entire corporate portfolio by the end of the business day. Higgins swallowed hard, his face pale and slick with sweat. He furiously typed on his keyboard, overriding the system protocols and confirming the mandate. The account was entirely frozen. I turned my back on the terrified manager and walked out of the office. The heavy glass doors slid open, and I stepped out into the blinding, oppressive heat of the afternoon sun. The loud roar of downtown traffic washed over me, but my mind was utterly silent, calculating the next strategic move in a war I had not started, but fully intended to finish. I reached the heavy door of my truck when my cell phone vibrated violently in my suit pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID displayed Naomi's face, bright and smiling, from a photograph taken months before she ever met Logan. I answered the call, preparing myself to gently guide her toward the ugly truth of the man she loved. I never got the chance to speak a single word. Naomi was crying hysterically, her voice shrill and fractured with absolute panic. She did not ask me how my day was, nor did she ask if I was okay. Instead, she launched into a furious, breathless accusation. She demanded to know why I had maliciously frozen the escrow account without consulting her first, and deliberately sabotaged the most important, time-sensitive business deal of her future husband's life. She told me Logan was utterly devastated, that he was simply trying to build a secure financial future for their new family, and that my actions were a direct, cruel attack on their relationship. Logan had already spun the narrative with terrifying speed, painting himself as the innocent victim of my tyrannical, old-school control. He had weaponized her absolute trust, using her tears as a convenient shield to protect his blatant theft. The psychological poison was already working its way through her mind, actively turning my own daughter against me before I could even present the undeniable audio evidence of his betrayal. I stood quietly by my truck, gripping the phone tightly, listening to the child I had protected my entire life fiercely defend the very predator actively trying to destroy us both. The maitre d' led me through a maze of crystal chandeliers and velvet booths at Le Petit Chateau. The restaurant smelled of truffles and expensive entitlement, a sharp contrast to the smell of diesel and hot asphalt I was accustomed to. I spotted them at a corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Naomi sat perfectly upright, wearing a silk dress I had paid for last month. Logan sat right beside her, his posture impeccably manicured. He was holding her hand with a practiced gentleness, his head tilted slightly downward. He was already playing the role of the wounded victim before I even pulled out my chair. I sat down across from them. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Logan did not stand to greet me. He simply offered a weak, sympathetic smile that made my blood run cold. I ordered a black coffee. Naomi looked at me with eyes full of defensive anger, her knuckles white where she gripped Logan's fingers. She had completely bought into whatever narrative he had spun during the frantic phone call earlier. I took a slow breath, letting the tension settle in my chest. I needed to see his hand. I needed to let him play his cards. I waited for the waiter to pour my coffee and step away. Then I looked directly at Logan, waiting for the lie to begin. Logan cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked at Naomi for permission, a calculated move to reinforce his submission to her before turning his pale blue eyes back to me. The performance was about to start, and I was entirely ready to observe and dissect every single flaw in his deeply arrogant execution. Logan steepled his fingers on the pristine white tablecloth. He spoke in a calm, measured, deeply condescending tone, the kind of voice a teacher uses to correct a slow student. "Lawrence," he began, dropping the usual courtesy he had used since they started dating. "Naomi and I understand why you overreacted at the bank today. Financial misunderstandings happen, especially when communication breaks down." He offered a soft, patronizing chuckle. "I assume you simply forgot our verbal agreement from last week's dinner. We discussed leveraging a small portion of the escrow for a short-term business loan to secure the primary venue deposit. There had been no dinner last week, and there had certainly been no verbal agreement between us." He was building a bridge of lies directly over a chasm of fraud. Before I could respond, Naomi leaned forward, her voice sharp and brittle. "Dad, you completely humiliated him in front of the branch manager. You froze our account over a simple administrative transfer." I looked at my daughter, trying to find the logical, brilliant woman I had raised. "He tried to wire $300,000 to an offshore holding company, Naomi. That is not an administrative transfer." Naomi shook her head furiously, her eyes flashing with a blind loyalty that terrified me. "It was an earnest money deposit for the European honeymoon estate, Dad." Logan explained everything to me. "You are being completely rigid and overly suspicious, just like you always are. Not everyone is trying to hustle you." Logan squeezed her hand, playing the peacemaker. "It is fine, darling. Your father built his company in a different era. He is used to fighting for every scrap. It is hard for him to understand modern capital flow. The sheer audacity of a bankrupt boy lecturing me on capital flow was staggering. He was gaslighting my daughter right in front of me, painting my decades of hard-earned business acumen as paranoid senility. He wanted her to believe my protective instincts were a symptom of an outdated, broken mind. He was turning my strength into a weapon against me. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not raise my voice or defend my legacy. I simply took a sip of my coffee, tasting the bitter roast, and let them believe they were winning. Looking at Naomi's fierce, misguided defense of this thief, an old ache settled deep in my chest. After my wife passed away from breast cancer 20 years ago, I raised Naomi entirely alone. I worked double shifts driving freight straight through the night from Chicago to Atlanta, sleeping in the cab of my truck just to afford her Ivy League tuition without taking out a single loan. I gave her the world so she would never have to depend on a man like Logan. Yet here she was, fiercely defending her captor. Logan reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, neatly folded legal document. He slid it across the linen tablecloth toward me. "Look, Lawrence, let us put this ugly misunderstanding behind us," Logan said with a warm, forgiving smile. "My accountants drafted this standard tax optimization form for the upcoming wedding. It just consolidates the venue liabilities and protects your personal assets from luxury taxes. If you sign this, we can clear the air and move forward as a family." He patted the document gently, his eyes gleaming with a predatory confidence. "It is a simple formality, Lawrence, just a simple formality." The trap was so obvious it was almost insulting. He was relying entirely on my emotional exhaustion and my desire to appease my angry daughter. He expected me to blindly sign the paper just to restore the peace at the table. I did not argue. I did not demand to read the fine print in front of them, nor did I point out that venue liabilities do not require a separate corporate filing. I simply picked up the document, folded it carefully, and slid it into the inner pocket of my leather briefcase. "I will have my legal team review it this afternoon," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "If everything is standard, we can move forward." Logan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his polished armor. He had wanted the signature right then and there. I signaled the waiter drop $200 bills on the table to cover their expensive lunch and stood up. I told Naomi I loved her, turned my back on them, and walked out of the restaurant. The valet brought my truck around. I climbed into the heavy cab, the familiar scent of worn leather grounding me in reality. I locked the doors, turned on the overhead cab light, and pulled the document from my briefcase. I bypassed the dense legal jargon on the first page and flipped directly to the execution clause at the back. I stared at the bold, undeniable text. It was not a tax optimization form. It was an irrevocable transfer of my company's primary voting rights. If I had signed that paper, I would have handed Logan the absolute legal authority to liquidate my entire fleet by tomorrow morning. The silent war had officially escalated from hidden cowardly theft to a completely hostile corporate takeover right before my very eyes. I drove straight from the restaurant to the business district, parking my truck in the underground garage of the glass high-rise where my corporate attorney Jonathan kept his offices. Jonathan and I had navigated complex labor disputes and aggressive corporate acquisitions for over 2 decades. He was a man who rarely showed emotion. I tossed the crisp document onto his wide glass desk without saying a word. Jonathan adjusted his reading glasses and began scanning the pages. Within seconds, his professional composure completely vanished. He looked up at me, his face tight with pure disbelief. He asked me where I had acquired this paperwork. I told him my future son-in-law had just presented it to me as a standard tax optimization form for the wedding. Jonathan slammed his hand onto the desk. He explained with absolute certainty that there was nothing standard about this contract. The document was a masterfully disguised, irrevocable transfer of my primary corporate voting rights. If my pen had touched the signature line, I would have instantly handed Logan the legal authority to dismantle my life's work. Logan would have possessed the unchecked power to liquidate my entire fleet of 300 transport trucks and sell off my 7 distribution warehouses to the highest bidder by the following morning. The sheer arrogance of presenting this to me over a plate of expensive French food made my jaw clench. Logan thought I was an uneducated laborer who would be too intimidated by complex legal jargon to verify the paperwork. He assumed my love for my daughter would override my business survival instincts. He was fatally incorrect. I told Jonathan to lock the document in his secure vault. It was time to stop playing defense. I sat down in the leather chair opposite Jonathan and gave him a clear, direct directive. I needed a complete, aggressive financial autopsy of Garrison Pierce and his entire family portfolio. Jonathan did not hesitate. He bypassed standard credit checks and immediately reached out to his high-level contacts within federal regulatory agencies. I watched him make a series of rapid coded phone calls from his secure landline, tapping into networks built over years of corporate litigation. 30 minutes later, Jonathan printed a highly classified dossier and laid it out in front of me. The facade of the untouchable Pierce dynasty crumbled instantly under the harsh light of forensic accounting. Garrison Pierce was not a wealthy real estate titan. He was a desperate, cornered man running a sophisticated shell game. Jonathan pointed to a series of flag transactions. Garrison was currently the primary target of a massive, heavily guarded investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal authorities had uncovered a staggering $15 million shortfall in his commercial investment funds. Garrison had been systematically defrauding his investors to maintain his lavish lifestyle, shifting phantom capital between dummy corporations to hide the missing millions. The walls were rapidly closing in on them. Federal indictments were being prepared in secret. I stared at the dense rows of numbers highlighting the financial decay of the Pierce estate. Jonathan explained that the SEC had already frozen several of Garrison's minor shell accounts, forcing them to operate on fumes. Every single smile Garrison had flashed at the engagement party was paid for with stolen funds. Logan was not a successful businessman. He was a well-dressed accomplice trying to secure a life raft before his family sank into absolute ruin. The timing of Logan proposing to my daughter suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The engagement was never about love. It was a calculated survival strategy. They were drowning in criminal liability and staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. Logan had targeted Naomi to secure an anchor to my pristine, debt-free logistics empire. They intended to use my corporate infrastructure and massive cash reserves to launder their dirty debt, quietly plugging the $15 million hole in their ledgers before the SEC could finalize the indictments. They planned to drain my life's work dry, leaving me bankrupt and taking Naomi down with them as collateral damage. The sheer scale of their malice required a response devoid of any mercy. The urgency in Logan's actions at the restaurant was the desperate thrashing of a drowning man. The entire old money persona the Pierce family projected was a meticulously constructed illusion built entirely on predatory credit and severe financial leverage. Their generational wealth had dried up a decade ago. Their exclusive country club memberships, the sprawling manicured estates, and the fleet of imported luxury cars were all leased, mortgaged, and borrowed against toxic assets. I thought about the first 5 years of building my company. I remembered eating cold meals in the dispatch booth and missing holidays just to ensure my drivers got paid on time. I built my fortune on calloused hands, honest sweat, and ironclad integrity. The Pierces built theirs on a mountain of deceit. They looked down on me because of the color of my skin and my working-class roots, assuming my hard-earned money was ripe for the taking. They desperately needed my spotless logistics empire to wash their sins away. They needed my unblemished reputation to act as a shield against federal prosecutors. They believed they could exploit a father's devotion to his daughter to wipe their slate clean. I refused to let my family become the sacrificial lamb for their criminal incompetence. As I finalized a strategy with Jonathan to insulate my assets, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the silent office. Jonathan glanced at his primary legal terminal. His face hardened as he quickly opened an incoming urgent notification from the county clerk's digital filing system. He turned the screen toward me, his voice tight with alarm. Logan was moving faster and more ruthlessly than we had anticipated. While I was sitting at the restaurant listening to his gaslighting, Logan's legal team had just filed a preemptive medical proxy request with the local family court. The document was a direct, aggressive assault on my autonomy. Logan cited my advanced age and submitted a completely fabricated medical report outlining a severe deteriorating heart condition and early onset cognitive decline. He was legally petitioning the court to seize temporary control of my estate and my medical decisions, claiming I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. The sheer viciousness of the tactic sent a surge of adrenaline straight to my core. Logan knew the forged tax document was a gamble, so he had prepared a devastating backup plan to bypass my consent entirely. If the court granted the temporary proxy based on that fraudulent medical claim, Logan could forcefully remove me from my own company and lock me out of my own life before the wedding even took place. He was trying to bury me alive using the judicial system. I stood up from the leather chair, my fists clenched at my sides. The time for observation was over. Logan had just declared total war. I asked Jonathan what our immediate window for a counteroffensive was. He warned me that temporary emergency proxies could be executed within 48 hours if the judge found the fabricated medical crisis credible. I had exactly 2 days to dismantle their offensive before they showed up at my front door with a court order. I drove back to my estate with the ticking clock of Logan's medical proxy echoing in my ears. I had exactly 48 hours to dismantle a legal trap designed to bury me alive. The heavy tires of my truck gripped the familiar winding road leading up to my property, a sprawling piece of land I had purchased outright 25 years ago. The thick canopy of oak trees usually provided a sense of profound peace, a barrier between my home and the relentless demands of the logistics industry. Today, that peace was shattered before I even shifted the engine into park. A massive, sleek black SUV was parked illegally, resting not on the wide circular driveway, but directly on the manicured grass of my front lawn. The heavy treads had already crushed a deep, muddy rut into the earth. 3 men wearing sharp business suits and reflective sunglasses were moving methodically across the yard. They were carrying professional surveying equipment, setting up digital lasers and pulling long reels of measuring tape across the property lines. They moved with the confident, brisk efficiency of men who had been given absolute authority over the domain. My eyes drifted past the surveyors and locked onto the wide wraparound porch of my home. Logan Pierce stood there, leaning casually against the wooden railing. He was holding a silver clipboard, dressed in a pristine pastel polo shirt and tailored slacks, surveying my land with the entitled smirk of a conqueror claiming his spoils. He pointed toward the southern quadrant of the yard, giving a loud, authoritative directive to one of the surveyors. The sheer invasion of the scene was a calculated assault, a deliberate provocation designed to elicit a volatile reaction. I stepped out of the truck and closed the heavy steel door with a solid, echoing thud. The sound drew the attention of the surveying crew, but Logan did not flinch. Instead, his smile widened, transforming into a mask of sickening, artificial cheerfulness. He walked down the porch steps to meet me, extending a hand that I completely ignored. He smoothly withdrew it, entirely unbothered, and tapped his clipboard. He spoke in a loud, bright tone, projecting his voice so the surveyors could hear every single word of his performance. He announced that he had hired a premier architectural and appraisal team to evaluate the estate for a comprehensive post-wedding renovation. He claimed that Naomi had mentioned how much she loved the idea of modernizing the property, suggesting we could transform the outdated grounds into a modern corporate retreat for the newly merged logistics firm. He was weaving a narrative of familial cooperation right in front of the men he hired, painting me as the lucky beneficiary of his visionary upgrades. I stood perfectly still, my face devoid of any emotion, refusing to give him the explosive reaction he desperately needed for his medical proxy claim. Logan stepped closer and pulled a thick blueprint from beneath the clip of his board. He handed me the printed demolition plan with a grand, sweeping gesture. I unfolded the heavy paper and examined the architectural schematics. The ink detailed a massive paving project, a luxury outdoor pavilion, and a widened commercial driveway. I traced the primary demolition zone with my eyes. The crosshairs of the destruction were targeted precisely over the southern quadrant of the estate. It was not a random architectural choice. Logan had specifically designated the complete bulldozing of the antique rose garden. He watched my eyes track across the paper, his smile remaining perfectly fixed, waiting for the devastating realization to strike my heart. He knew exactly what that piece of land meant to me. He wanted me to scream. He wanted to document a frantic, irrational old man aggressively attacking his well-meaning son-in-law. Every single breath I took was a measured, conscious effort to deny him that victory. I slowly folded the demolition plan, smoothing the creases with my thumbs, locking my rising fury away behind a wall of absolute, chilling silence. I looked past Logan toward the southern quadrant. I looked at the blooming antique roses swaying in the afternoon breeze. I remembered the exact weekend 30 years ago when my late wife and I marked out that garden. I remembered hauling the heavy bags of rich topsoil by hand, my back aching from a grueling work week, while she knelt in the dirt, carefully planting every single root. It was a sanctuary of life she nurtured until her final days. Logan was not just trying to steal my corporate empire. He was trying to pave over the sacred memory of my wife. I did not raise my voice. I did not utter a single word to the arrogant boy standing in front of me. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. Anticipating aggressive real estate maneuvers, Jonathan had drafted a general cease and desist letter before I left his office. I walked straight past Logan and approached the lead appraiser. I handed the legal document directly to the professional. I informed the man that he was trespassing on a privately owned estate, and if his crew did not vacate the premises within 60 seconds, I would personally ensure his firm's operating license was permanently revoked for participating in an unauthorized property seizure. The lead appraiser snatched the document, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal header bearing Jonathan's prestigious firm logo. The color drained from the surveyor's face. Professionals in the real estate sector recognized absolute authority when they saw it, and they knew better than to entangle themselves in a millionaire's hostile domestic dispute. He shouted a sharp command to his team. The three men immediately scrambled hastily, packing up their expensive laser tripods and reeling in their measuring tapes. They threw their equipment into the back of the black SUV, completely ignoring Logan's sudden protests. The heavy vehicle tore across the lawn, kicking up clumps of ruined grass before speeding down the driveway and disappearing onto the main road. The grand audience was gone. The performance abruptly ended. Logan was left standing alone on my porch holding a useless clipboard. The cheerful, innocent son-in-law mask evaporated into the humid afternoon air. He dropped the clipboard onto the wooden deck. He stepped down the stairs and walked into my personal space, entirely abandoning the illusion of respect. His pale eyes went dead, reflecting a pure, unadulterated malice. He did not yell. He spoke in a vicious, measured whisper that revealed the true depth of his sociopathy. He told me that my little legal tricks would only delay the inevitable. He explicitly promised that if I did not sign the company over to him voluntarily by the end of the week, he would marry Naomi, immediately take her to Europe on an extended honeymoon, and systematically isolate her. He promised to manipulate her fragile trust until she viewed me as a complete enemy, ensuring that I would die alone in this empty house, never seeing my daughter or my future grandchildren ever again. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my lawn. I stood completely still in the center of my ruined front lawn, watching the dust settle from the tires of the departing surveyor vehicle. The muddy tracks carved into the grass were a physical manifestation of Logan Pierce's audacity, but his final whispered threat was the true devastating weapon. He intended to take my daughter across the globe, isolate her entirely from her support system, and erase my existence from her future. He truly believed his psychological hold over Naomi was an impenetrable shield. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that I would fold and sign away my life's work simply to protect my access to my own child. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man he was threatening. I knew instantly that a direct emotional approach would be fatal. If I went to Naomi right now and repeated Logan's vicious ultimatum, she would not believe a single word I said. Her mind was currently thoroughly poisoned by his constant calculated gaslighting. He had already laid the groundwork, painting me as a paranoid, controlling tyrant who was actively trying to sabotage her happiness. Any desperate warning I gave her would simply be twisted into further proof of my supposed irrationality and drive her directly into his arms. I had to bypass Naomi entirely for the time being. I could not simply cut the weeds Logan was planting around my family. I had to salt the earth his entire lineage stood upon. If Logan wanted to use his fabricated wealth and old money status as a bludgeon, I would systematically dismantle the very foundation of his world. I needed a lethal, entirely silent counter-strategy that would strip the Pierce family of their illusions and leave them completely exposed. I walked back to my truck, brushed the dirt from my suit jacket, and climbed into the cab. I started the engine, leaving the desecrated rose garden behind. I drove directly toward the heart of the city, steering away from traditional legal channels and heading straight toward the financial district. The towering glass and steel structures of the financial sector cast long, sharp shadows over the busy afternoon streets. I bypassed the main corporate banking hubs and parked in a subterranean garage beneath a nondescript, brutalist concrete building. This was a place where wealth was not merely stored but aggressively weaponized. I rode a private elevator to the 14th floor, stepping into a dimly lit, soundproof reception area devoid of any corporate branding. A silent assistant guided me down a narrow corridor and opened a heavy acoustic door. Elias sat behind a vast desk crafted from polished black stone. He was a shadow broker, a man who facilitated the aggressive acquisition and liquidation of distressed corporate debt far outside the scrutiny of traditional regulatory markets. He operated entirely in the gray spaces where desperate families like the Pierces sold their financial souls to stay afloat. Elias did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite him. I opened my briefcase and handed him the heavily encrypted digital dossier Jonathan had prepared, detailing Garrison Pierce's $15 million shortfall and his extensive web of secondary creditors. I instructed Elias to immediately locate and purchase every single outstanding note, margin call, and defaulted loan belonging to the Pierce family estate. I did not want a fraction of their debt. I wanted absolute singular ownership of their financial ruin. Elias scanned the digital files, his eyes darting across the screen as he assessed the sheer volume of toxic liabilities Garrison had accumulated. He noted that the secondary creditors were already anxious, panicked by the quiet rumors of the impending Securities and Exchange Commission investigation. They would be incredibly eager to offload the toxic debt for pennies on the dollar to anyone willing to assume the risk. I told Elias to offer them a premium above the market rate to secure the acquisitions instantly and silently. I demanded that the purchases be routed through anonymous shell corporations, ensuring that Garrison and Logan would have absolutely no idea that their debt was changing hands. Elias leaned back in his chair, tapping a heavy silver pen against the desk. He warned me that buying the entirety of the Pierce family's defaulted portfolio would require an astronomical amount of immediate liquid capital, far exceeding what I currently held in available cash reserves outside my frozen corporate accounts. He needed substantial collateral to underwrite the rapid acquisitions. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I reached back into my briefcase and withdrew the original unencumbered property deeds for two of my largest commercial distribution warehouses. I laid the heavy notarized documents directly onto the Blackstone desk. I had purchased those specific warehouses 20 years ago, spending months sleeping on a cheap cot in the dispatch office just to oversee the night shifts and guarantee our delivery quotas were met. Those structures were the physical anchors of my logistics empire, representing years of relentless, agonizing labor. Now I was leveraging them as collateral to fund the absolute destruction of my enemy. Elias examined the deeds, carefully verifying their immense market value. He nodded, satisfied that the collateral was ironclad, and immediately began executing the massive financial transfers through his secure network. As he typed, a profound realization washed over me. I was buying the very chains that held the Pierce family hostage. By acquiring their debt, I was severing their ties to their desperate creditors and transitioning from their intended victim to their sole absolute master. I was purchasing the right to dictate their total ruin. The heavy silence of the soundproof office stretched on as Elias navigated the dark financial networks aggressively sweeping up the Pierce family's toxic liabilities. The green glow of his monitors illuminated his focused expression as he confirmed the successful transfer of each defaulted loan margin call and secondary debt obligation. Within an hour, he had effectively purchased the entirety of Garrison Pierce's financial existence. Elias printed the confirmation ledgers, compiled the documents, and placed them inside a thick red folder. He slid the folder across the black stone desk. I rested my hand on the heavy cardboard, feeling the tangible weight of my victory. I owned them. But as I moved to open the folder and review the final tallies, Elias raised a hand, stopping me. His expression was suddenly grim, completely devoid of the cold satisfaction he usually displayed after a successful acquisition. He told me that while sweeping the financial registries to locate Garrison's secondary creditors, his algorithms had flagged a highly alarming newly generated transaction directly linked to my personal family trust. Elias tapped his keyboard, turning a secondary monitor toward me so I could see the raw data. He warned me to look closely at the screen. The digital ledger displayed a massive, freshly approved predatory loan issued by a ruthless private equity firm just hours ago. The loan was for an exorbitant amount of capital, structured with lethal, unpayable interest rates designed to force an immediate default. I stared at the guarantor signatures listed at the bottom of the digital contract. The primary borrower was listed as Naomi. The ultimate collateral backing the entire predatory loan was a direct, legally binding lien against my company's most profitable subsidiary account. Logan had not just frozen the wedding funds. He had forged a weapon designed to bankrupt my daughter and drag my corporation down with her. The digital ledger on Elias's monitor burned a permanent, vivid image into my mind. Logan had not simply manipulated my daughter into a bad engagement. He had weaponized her very identity to secure a financial death warrant for my entire enterprise. I thanked Elias, took the heavy red folder containing the Pierce family's absolute ruin, and walked out into the humid evening air. I did not go home to rest. I drove straight to the towering glass facade of Vanguard Capital, the notoriously predatory private equity firm listed on the loan documents. It was early the next morning when I walked through their polished brass doors. The lobby was designed to intimidate, filled with sharp architectural angles, cold white marble, and receptionists trained to turn away anyone without a high-tier appointment. I bypassed the front desk entirely. I knew exactly how these boutique firms operated, hiding behind layers of corporate bureaucracy while executing ruthless backroom deals. I scanned the digital directory, found the suite number for the senior underwriting division, and took the private elevator to the 40th floor. I walked past the startled executive assistants and pushed open the frosted glass door of the lead loan officer, a man named Sterling. He sat behind a modern glass desk wearing a tailored Italian suit, looking up with an expression of profound elitist irritation. He opened his mouth to demand his private security remove me from the premises. I did not give him the chance to speak a single syllable. I dropped my state driver's license and my corporate founder identification badge directly onto his keyboard. I told him my name and demanded to see the original hard copy paperwork for the multi-million-dollar loan authorized against my subsidiary account the previous afternoon. Sterling bristled, puffing out his chest to project absolute authority, but the sheer, cold rage in my eyes forced him to remain completely seated in his expensive leather chair. Sterling quickly recovered his arrogant composure, adopting the smug, untouchable attitude typical of men who gamble with other people's livelihoods for a living. He leaned back, lacing his manicured fingers together, and informed me that the transaction was entirely legally binding, fully authorized, and vetted by all necessary parties. I did not flinch. I demanded the physical documents. Muttering about protocol and client disruption, he unlocked his bottom drawer and produced a thick stack of loan applications bound in a heavy blue folder. He slid the paperwork across the glass desk with a condescending smirk, challenging me to find a single flaw in their airtight corporate processes. I ignored his posturing and flipped directly to the final signature pages. The paper felt heavy, bearing the official embossed seals of the equity firm. There, on the primary guarantor line, was Naomi's signature. It was delicate and precise, an exact match of my daughter's handwriting. Right beside it, securing the ultimate collateral against my most profitable logistics subsidiary, was my own signature. I stared at the dark blue ink. To an untrained eye or a careless loan officer eager for a massive commission, the signature looked flawless. The looping cursive, the sharp cross of the T, and the broad sweep of the capital L were nearly perfect replicas. But Logan had made a critical, arrogant mistake. The forgery was exceptionally well executed, but it was far too smooth. It possessed the fluid, unbothered strokes of a healthy young man holding a pen. It completely lacked the heavy, rigid slant that defined my actual signature. 2 decades ago, I had crushed my right wrist under a falling steel beam at a loading dock in Detroit. The surgeons had reconstructed the bone with thick metal pins, leaving my hand permanently stiff and scarred. Writing for me required deliberate, heavy physical pressure, resulting in a distinct, jagged slant that no machine or tracing paper could ever fully replicate. I ran my calloused thumb over the fraudulent ink, feeling the smooth, uninterrupted glide of the pen. Logan had clearly taken an old pre-injury document from my home office and traced it. He had meticulously practiced the loops, completely unaware of the physical trauma embedded in my true handwriting. I looked up from the paper, fixing my gaze on the smug loan officer. I informed him that the signature was a blatant amateur forgery. Sterling laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He boldly claimed that his firm utilized the most rigorous identity verification protocols in the state, and that my accusations were nothing more than a wealthy man's buyer's remorse. I remembered finding Logan wandering near my private home office a month ago, claiming he was simply looking for a working printer to print out wedding venue brochures. He had used that brief, unsupervised window to hunt for viable templates, selecting a decades-old tax return to practice his theft. He thought he was brilliant. He thought I was an unobservant old fool who would never notice the missing paperwork until the trap was already sprung. I kept my voice dead level, refusing to let my anger boil over into an irrational outburst that he could use against me. I leaned forward, resting my injured, scarred wrist heavily on the glass desk, and demanded that Sterling pull the security footage from the exact hour the application was physically submitted. Sterling's arrogant smile vanished instantly. He abruptly pulled the blue folder back across the desk, his face tightening into a defensive, aggressive scowl. He flatly refused my request. He cited strict corporate privacy policies and ironclad client confidentiality clauses, claiming that turning over internal surveillance without a direct court order was a massive violation of banking protocols. He smugly suggested that I hire a lawyer and attempt to sue the firm, fully confident that I would drown in years of expensive, endless litigation before ever seeing a single frame of video. I did not argue with the man. I did not waste my breath negotiating with a corporate parasite who prioritized his quarterly commission over federal law. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. Elias, the shadow broker, had not only secured the Pierce family's massive debt, but he had also provided me with a comprehensive digital footprint of the predatory loan's execution. I opened the encrypted file and slid my phone across the glass desk, stopping it right in front of Sterling. I told him to look very closely at the illuminated timestamps. The digital logs clearly proved that Vanguard Capital had completely bypassed mandatory federal identity verifications to expedite the massive loan. Sterling had personally overridden the biometric security requirements and the stringent in-person guarantor mandates, rushing the paperwork through to secure his massive end-of-quarter bonus. I promised Sterling that if he did not hand over the security footage immediately, I would walk directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission with absolute proof of his severe regulatory violations. I promised him he would lose his license, his lucrative career, and face federal prison time for facilitating a multi-million-dollar wire fraud. The threat struck him like a physical blow. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him pale and sweating under the harsh fluorescent office lights. Terrified of losing everything, his arrogant posturing crumbled instantly. With shaking hands, he turned to his computer terminal and accessed the secure internal surveillance archive. He pulled up the high-definition footage from the lobby and his own office, isolating the exact hour the fraudulent application was submitted. He turned the monitor toward me, his breathing ragged. The video played in crystal-clear resolution. It showed Logan Pierce sitting in that exact leather chair holding a luxury fountain pen. The footage clearly, undeniably captured Logan signing my name on the dotted line, sealing his own fate. The high-definition surveillance footage from Vanguard Capital provided more than just absolute proof of Logan's forgery. It gave me the vital missing link in Garrison Pierce's financial labyrinth. As I watched the video file Jonathan had extracted, I noticed the man sitting beside Logan during the loan signing. He was not a bank employee. He was actively directing Logan on where to sign my name, pointing a gold pen at the signature lines with practiced, ruthless efficiency. I sent a high-resolution screenshot to Jonathan, who identified the man within 10 minutes. His name was Eris, a boutique wealth manager known in elite circles for handling distressed assets and setting up impenetrable shell corporations. He was the corrupt architect behind the Pierce family's financial survival. I knew exactly where to find men like Eris on a Thursday afternoon. I drove my heavy-duty truck away from the financial district and headed toward the outskirts of the city, pulling up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Oakmont Country Club. It was a notoriously exclusive members-only establishment built on generational wealth and quiet discrimination. The security guard at the gatehouse stepped out, fully intending to turn away a black man driving a work truck. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I handed him a crisp $100 bill and stated I was a private contractor summoned by Eris for an emergency structural consultation on the clubhouse patio. The guard quietly pocketed the cash and opened the gate. I parked near the tennis courts, leaving my work boots heavy on the manicured grass. I walked straight through the opulent clubhouse, completely bypassing the host, and stepped out onto the sunlit dining terrace. I scanned the sea of white linen and pastel sweaters until I spotted my target. Eris was sitting alone at a corner table overlooking the 18th hole, enjoying a plate of seared scallops and a glass of expensive white wine. I did not ask for permission to join him. I pulled out the wrought iron chair opposite Eris and sat down heavily, the metal legs scraping sharply against the stone patio. Eris looked up from his meal, his face instantly contorting in pure aristocratic indignation. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and demanded to know who I was and how I had bypassed the club's strict security. He threatened to have me forcibly removed for trespassing. I remained completely silent, letting his entitled outrage burn out against my absolute composure. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out my tablet alongside a thick manila folder. I placed the tablet directly onto his porcelain plate right beside his half-eaten meal. I tapped the screen once. The video from Vanguard Capital began to play, clearly showing Eris sitting shoulder to shoulder with Logan Pierce, while Logan blatantly forged my signature on a multi-million-dollar predatory loan application. Eris's jaw tightened. He tried to quickly swipe the tablet away, dismissing it as a fabricated digital fake, but his manicured hands were already beginning to tremble. I did not let him speak. I opened the manila folder and dropped a heavy stack of unredacted documents over his wine glass. It was the complete printed Securities and Exchange Commission investigation file targeting Garrison Pierce. It highlighted the $15 million shortfall and the specific offshore shell companies Eris had personally established to hide the missing funds. The color drained entirely from Eris's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked frantically around the dining terrace, terrified that his affluent peers might overhear the sudden destruction of his career. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, invading his space entirely. I spoke in a low, unwavering voice that cut through the polite chatter of the country club. I informed him that I was Lawrence, the owner of the logistics empire his clients were currently attempting to steal. I told him that the digital trail Elias had uncovered led directly to his boutique firm. He was not merely a financial advisor. He was the primary accomplice in a massive federal wire fraud scheme and an active participant in an illegal corporate takeover. Eris tried to swallow, but his throat was completely dry. He was looking at the undeniable end of his life as a free man. I presented Eris with a singular, non-negotiable choice. He could walk out of this country club, pack his bags, and spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for aiding and abetting the Pierce family's criminal enterprise. Or he could provide me with the exact routing numbers, security tokens, and access codes to every single offshore account Garrison Pierce currently utilized to hide his remaining liquid assets. I watched the wealthy advisor squirm in his tailored suit, his eyes darting frantically for an exit that did not exist. I had spent decades building a clean business, ensuring every driver in my fleet was paid fairly and every tax dollar was completely accounted for. Men like Eris produced absolutely nothing of real value. They simply moved invisible numbers on a screen, siphoning wealth from honest working people to protect parasitic families like the Pierces. I had absolutely zero sympathy for his current panic. I pulled out my phone and set a visible timer. I gave him exactly 60 seconds to make his decision before I forwarded the unredacted federal files and the forgery video directly to the district attorney's primary fraud division. Sweating profusely, Eris did not even wait for the timer to reach 30 seconds. He reached down with trembling hands and hauled his expensive leather briefcase onto his lap. He fumbled with the brass combination locks, his polished professional facade entirely shattered. He pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive and slid it across the table toward me, treating it like a live explosive. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, completely abandoning his upscale lunch. He told me the drive contained a master ledger of every single illegal wire transfer Logan and Garrison had executed over the past 36 months. It held the offshore routing numbers, the dummy corporation registries, and the exact locations of the remaining funds they had stolen from their investors. I took the flash drive and slipped it securely into my pocket, locking away the final piece of the Pierce family's financial execution. But Eris was not finished. Desperate to ensure his own total immunity from my wrath, he leaned closer, dropping his voice to a frantic whisper. He revealed a damning detail that completely altered the timeline of my entire counteroffensive. He told me that Logan had absolutely no intention of sticking around to manage the logistics company after the hostile takeover was complete. Eris had personally processed a highly confidential transaction for the groom just yesterday morning. Logan had already booked a one-way first-class flight to Geneva, Switzerland. The departure was scheduled for the morning immediately following the wedding ceremony. Logan was planning to drain my company dry-wire the stolen funds into an untraceable Swiss account and board a plane, leaving Naomi completely abandoned, legally tied to his massive debt and facing total financial ruin alone. The cold, calculated cruelty of his exit strategy required immediate, absolute destruction. The heavy oak front door of my estate did not just open. It struck the interior wall with the force of a detonated explosive. I was sitting at the kitchen island, mentally reviewing the digital ledger I had just extracted from Eris, when the sharp echo of high heels hammered against the hardwood hallway. Naomi stormed into the room, bringing a freezing gust of evening air with her. Her face was flushed, her jaw set tight with a manufactured righteous fury that I instantly recognized. It was not her own anger. It was a perfectly crafted reflection of Logan's manipulation. Before I could even stand to greet her, she launched into a blistering verbal assault. Logan had struck first, anticipating my counteroffensive. He had spent the afternoon meticulously weaving a narrative of absolute victimhood, painting himself as the innocent target of a tyrannical, paranoid old man. Naomi screamed that Logan had come to her in tears, claiming I had physically threatened him on my front porch and viciously attacked his family's honor. He told her I had hired aggressive private investigators to stalk his parents and harass his business associates out of a twisted, possessive jealousy. He had completely inverted reality, casting my defense of my own estate as a maniacal campaign to destroy their impending marriage. Naomi stood in the center of my kitchen, vibrating with rage, looking at me, not as a father who had protected her for 28 years, but as a malicious enemy actively trying to ruin her future. The poison Logan had poured into her ear was working flawlessly, turning her completely against her only genuine anchor in the world. She paced the length of the kitchen floor, her arms crossing and uncrossing in defensive, agitated strikes. She was wearing a stunning, full-length cashmere coat. It was a breathtaking piece of designer outerwear that reeked of absolute exclusivity. I recognized the label instantly. It was an obscenely expensive garment, and knowing what I now knew about the Pierce family's hollow bank accounts, I knew exactly how it had been purchased. Every thread of that luxurious cashmere was woven with the stolen funds from Garrison's defrauded investors, or worse, paid for by the predatory loan Logan had just illegally secured against my own logistics empire using her forged signature. She was wrapped in the very financial ruin her fiancé had orchestrated for her. I remained seated at the solid oak kitchen table, my posture entirely relaxed. I did not raise my hands defensively. I did not attempt to match her escalating volume. I simply reached for the heavy ceramic pot on the counter and slowly poured myself a fresh cup of dark coffee. I took a measured sip, letting the bitter warmth ground me, and listened. Naomi screamed that my actions were pathetic. She accused me of being incapable of handling the reality that she was growing up and slipping out of my control. She claimed my supposed harassment of the Pierce family was nothing more than a desperate authoritarian tactic to keep her chained to my side forever. Logan had convinced her that my refusal to blindly hand over my corporate voting rights was an act of extreme financial abuse meant to sabotage their independence. She echoed his exact phrases using corporate buzzwords and psychological terms that belonged entirely to his manipulative vocabulary. She called me bitter. She called me possessive. She stood in the kitchen I had built to shelter her, wearing a coat bought with stolen money, and demanded that I beg for her fiancé's forgiveness. I sat there in absolute silence, letting the echo of her accusations bounce off the walls, absorbing every single hateful word without offering a fraction of a rebuttal. I knew that arguing with a victim of severe psychological conditioning was not just futile. It was actively detrimental. Every defense I offered would simply be weaponized against me, confirming the exact paranoid narrative Logan had so carefully planted in her mind. The heavy black flash drive Eris had given me burned like a hot coal in my suit pocket, sitting right next to the printed legal countermeasures Jonathan had prepared, specifically the physical files named Kichban Ong Da Den 2_14.docx and Kichban Ong Da Den Mao 1_14.docx. They contained the undeniable, irrefutable proof of Logan's imminent flight to Geneva, his massive wire frauds, and the total bankruptcy of the Pierce estate. It would only take 10 seconds to plug the drive into my laptop and show her the flight itineraries and the forged loan documents. But I kept my hand firmly away from my pocket. Her mind was currently too deeply poisoned by his gaslighting. If I presented the raw data to her in this volatile defensive state, her cognitive dissonance would instantly reject it. She would view the federal files as fabricated documents I had commissioned to frame him. Worse, her first instinct would be to run straight back to Logan to confront him with my accusations, giving him the critical window he needed to destroy the evidence, accelerate his flight to Switzerland, and drag her down into federal indictments with him. I had to let her believe she was entirely in control of the narrative. Naomi stopped pacing. Her breathing was heavy, her chest heaving as she stared down at me, waiting for the explosive, tyrannical reaction Logan had promised her I would deliver. When I simply took another slow sip of coffee, her frustration reached a boiling point. She reached behind her neck and unclasped the delicate, solid gold chain she had worn every single day for the past 6 years. It was the custom necklace I had commissioned for her college graduation, a quiet symbol of my immense pride in her independence and her bright future. She pulled the gold from her skin and threw it violently onto the kitchen table. The metal struck the hard wood with a sharp final clatter, sliding across the polished surface until it stopped inches from my coffee cup. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice dropping into a cold, absolute finality. She delivered a non-negotiable ultimatum, dictated directly by her puppet master. She informed me that my presence was officially a toxic threat to her new family. I was formally uninvited from the wedding ceremony. She promised me that the only way I would ever be allowed back into her life or permitted to walk her down the aisle was if I fully complied with Logan's demands. I had until exactly 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon to legally sign over the complete transfer documents for my logistics firm to Logan. If my signature was not on that corporate contract by the deadline, she would cut me out of her life permanently. She turned on her heel and walked out the front door, slamming shut, leaving the gold chain resting in the dead silence of the kitchen. The gold chain remained exactly where Naomi had thrown it, a cold reminder of the Friday 3 o'clock deadline she had delivered before storming out of my kitchen. I did not wait for Friday afternoon. When the sun broke over the city skyline on Friday morning, I was already sitting across from Jonathan in his secured downtown law office. The sprawling mahogany table was completely cleared of its usual decorative clutter, replaced by precisely stacked legal folios. The air in the room was heavy with the gravity of what we were about to execute. Jonathan had his entire elite legal team working through the night, drafting the most complex, aggressive corporate defense strategy of my entire career. We were not merely building a defensive wall around my assets. We were constructing an impenetrable legal fortress designed to withstand a siege from both federal entities and predatory private equity firms. The threat Logan posed was no longer just an internal family dispute over a wedding ceremony. It was a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar hostile corporate takeover fueled by forged documents and desperate offshore debts. Logan expected me to arrive at the wedding venue by mid-afternoon completely broken, carrying the surrender documents that would hand him the keys to my logistics empire. He believed the ticking clock and the threat of losing my daughter forever would override my business survival instincts. He fundamentally misunderstood the sheer lengths I would go to protect the legacy I had built from the ground up. Jonathan slid a heavy black titanium pen across the desk, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute professional certainty. He informed me that once the ink touched the paper, the structural reality of my entire corporate empire would be permanently, irreversibly altered. There would be absolutely no turning back, no room for second thoughts, and no loopholes for anyone to exploit. I picked up the pen without a fraction of hesitation. Jonathan began laying out the 50 pages of dense, heavily verified legal contracts. I methodically moved through the stack, pressing the heavy pen into the parchment, letting the jagged, distinct slant of my injured wrist leave its permanent mark on every single signature line. I was not transferring my wealth to a hidden offshore account or shifting capital into Naomi's name. I was executing a comprehensive, absolute transfer of my entire construction and logistics empire into an irrevocable blind trust. I was legally stripping myself of all direct ownership and executive liquidating authority. By signing these documents, I actively transferred the total operational control of the fleet, the vast network of commercial warehouses, and the massive cash reserves to a newly established, aggressively strict corporate board of directors. Jonathan had handpicked the board members from his network of the most ruthless, uncompromised fiduciary managers in the commercial sector. They were men and women who operated solely on data and legal mandates, completely immune to emotional manipulation, family drama, or predatory loan officers. I signed the final page, transferring the primary commercial accounts, feeling a profound, absolute sense of relief wash over my tired shoulders. The trap Logan had so carefully set was now entirely obsolete. If Logan attempted to execute the fraudulent predatory loan he had taken out using my forged signature and Naomi's identity, Vanguard Capital would hit a massive, impenetrable legal wall. The subsidiary accounts Logan had used as collateral no longer belonged to Lawrence the individual. They belonged to an entity that could not be coerced, threatened, or blackmailed. The moment the private equity firm attempted to seize the funds, Jonathan's board of directors would instantly trigger a massive federal fraud investigation, trapping Logan in his own meticulously designed snare. I meticulously initialed the final addendums, ensuring that the corporate charter explicitly barred any individual outside the designated board from viewing the operational ledgers. Logan wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft, relying on the predictable emotions of a grieving father. I removed the father entirely from the financial equation, replacing him with a cold, faceless, and heavily armed legal entity that Logan could never hope to intimidate. The structural brilliance of the irrevocable blind trust was its absolute terrifying finality. I stared at the towering stack of signed documents, knowing exactly what they represented. Neither I nor Naomi nor Logan Pierce could ever liquidate a single transport truck or sell a fraction of an acre of warehouse property. The company I had built with calloused hands, sacrificing my youth and enduring grueling night shifts on freezing dispatch docks, was permanently bulletproof. It was fully insulated from any hostile takeover gambling debts or desperate offshore wire transfers. I had bled for 2 decades to establish an honest, towering empire in an industry known for crushing weakness. I had endured shattered bones, exhausting physical labor, and endless nights away from my family to secure this legacy. I refused to let a manicured, arrogant boy tear it down to pay for his family's criminal incompetence and fraudulent lifestyle. The legacy was secured legally bound in iron, untouchable by the greed that infected the Pierce lineage. The logistics firm would outlive us all, functioning exactly as I intended, protecting Naomi's long-term financial survival, even if she currently despised me for it. Jonathan gathered the towering stack of signed contracts, moving with the rapid, precise efficiency of a man securing a monumental victory. He reached for his heavy steel notary embosser, bringing it down hard on the final page of the trust charter. The sharp mechanical crunch of the metal seal permanently binding the documents echoed loudly in the quiet office. The empire was officially locked away. But in the exact fraction of a second that the seal was struck, a jarring, high-pitched notification chime erupted from Jonathan's primary computer terminal. The sudden noise shattered the momentary peace. Jonathan dropped the embosser and immediately turned to the screen, his professional composure instantly evaporating. His face drained of color as he rapidly clicked through the urgent digital dispatch flashing across the secure legal portal. I stood up from the mahogany table, recognizing the genuine alarm in my attorney's eyes. Jonathan spun the monitor toward me, his voice tight with the sudden severe urgency. While we had spent the morning securing the corporate assets, Logan's legal team had escalated their offensive to a terrifying new level. They had just successfully bypassed the standard family court wait times and filed a massive, heavily verified emergency medical injunction. Logan had submitted the fabricated psychological reports and leveraged Naomi's volatile testimony from the previous night to convince a judge that I was in immediate critical danger to myself and my estate. Jonathan pointed to the bottom of the digital filing, highlighting the judge's expedited ruling. The court had fully granted the temporary proxy. State-appointed medical evaluators escorted by local law enforcement were already dispatched and actively en route to my private residence. They were authorized to immediately seize physical control of my person and freeze all accessible assets before the weekend began. The race was no longer just about corporate survival. It was a literal race for my physical freedom. I barely beat the flashing lights to my own front door. The dust from my truck's tires had not even settled on the driveway when a trio of vehicles breached the main gates of my estate. A marked county sheriff's cruiser led the aggressive procession, its lights spinning silently in the afternoon sun. It was followed by a drab, unmarked sedan typical of state bureaucratic agencies. Finally, Logan's least luxury SUV pulled in, parking exactly where his surveying crew had ruined my grass just days ago. I stood alone on my wide wraparound porch, watching the heavy doors open. 2 armed officers stepped out, hanging back near the hood of their cruiser, their presence a silent, heavy intimidation tactic designed to keep me compliant. From the sedan emerged 2 middle-aged individuals carrying thick leather briefcases. Their faces were set in the tired clinical masks of state-appointed psychological evaluators. Then came Logan. He stepped out of his vehicle, radiating an absolute, sickening aura of triumph. He held a thick stack of legal documents in his right hand, the court-mandated emergency injunction rolled tightly like a baton. He walked up my front steps not as a future son-in-law, but as a warden arriving to collect a condemned prisoner. He looked at me with a smirk that communicated total victory, utterly convinced that he had finally outmaneuvered me. He believed he was about to rip me from my home, strip me of my human rights, and take immediate physical control of my wealth before the sun went down. The evaluators flanked him, looking at me with the cautious, scrutinizing eyes of professionals trained to deal with the volatile and the deeply confused. Logan stepped forward, brandishing the paper, his voice dripping with fabricated, sickeningly sweet concern as he announced they were here to get me the urgent help I desperately needed. I did not give Logan the satisfaction of a volatile reaction. I did not shout, nor did I demand the police officers intervene and remove him from my property. I simply stepped aside, opened my heavy oak front door wider, and gestured politely for the state evaluators to enter my home. I spoke in a calm, hospitable tone, inviting them into the main living room and offering them freshly brewed coffee from the kitchen. The sheer unshakable normalcy of my reaction threw them off balance for a fraction of a second, but they quickly recovered their clinical detachment. Logan followed them inside, hovering near the entryway like a vulture eager to witness my intellectual execution. The evaluators sat on my leather sofa, opening their briefcases and clicking their pens with practiced synchronization. They began the assessment with the standard, highly condescending battery of questions designed to gauge severe cognitive decline. They spoke to me slowly, over-enunciating their syllables as if addressing a lost toddler. The female evaluator asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, and my current physical address. I answered her with crisp, immediate precision. The male evaluator leaned forward, his tone patronizing, and asked me to name the current president of the country, followed by the current year, month, and day of the week. I looked him directly in the eye, my posture perfectly straight, and delivered the answers in a cold, flawless cadence. I did not hesitate. I did not stumble over a single syllable. They asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I rattled off the numbers with the rhythmic, calculated speed of a man who had built a massive logistics empire by managing complex, high-velocity data streams in his head for decades. I watched the evaluators exchange a brief, uncertain glance. The man sitting in front of them did not match the frantic, deteriorating profile detailed in the emergency injunction. Logan's smirk began to falter, the edges of his mouth tightening as he realized I was not exhibiting an ounce of the confusion or hostility he had so carefully documented in his fraudulent filings. He tried to interject, attempting to goad me by bringing up the incident with the surveyors, hoping to trigger an angry outburst that would validate his claims of paranoia. I completely ignored his presence, keeping my unwavering focus entirely on the medical professionals. I politely interrupted the female evaluator as she prepared her next patronizing memory test. I stood up from my armchair and walked across the room to the heavy steel wall safe concealed behind a wooden panel. I input the complex alphanumeric code rapidly, without breaking eye contact with the professionals sitting on my sofa. Years ago, when I first expanded my commercial fleet across state lines, I realized that my mind was the most valuable asset my company possessed. I made it a strict personal policy to undergo rigorous comprehensive health screenings annually to ensure my leadership remained legally unassailable. 2 days prior, the very morning Jonathan had warned me about Logan's potential medical proxy threat, I had quietly booked a premium, expedited appointment at the state's top private neurological facility. I pulled a thick, sealed medical dossier from the safe and returned to the seating area. I handed the pristine, officially stamped envelope directly to the lead evaluator. I informed them that it contained a comprehensive brain scan and a deeply rigorous cognitive assessment administered by the foremost neurological expert in the state, proving I had scored in the highest percentile for a man 20 years my junior. The male evaluator broke the heavy wax seal and extracted the thick stack of medical documents. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the detailed neurological imaging reports, the verified cognitive test scores, and the absolutely flawless mental health clearance signed by a chief of medicine whose credentials far outranked his own. The profound silence in the living room stretched into an agonizing wait. The evaluators read the final summary, which explicitly stated that my executive function, memory retention, and rational decision-making capabilities were in pristine, optimal condition. There was absolutely zero medical or legal justification for a state-mandated guardianship. The female evaluator slowly closed the file. She looked up from the documents and fixed a furious, piercing glare directly onto Logan Pierce. The state professionals instantly realized they had been weaponized. Logan had manipulated the judicial system, committing blatant perjury to drag them out to my estate on a fraudulent, malicious errand. The lead evaluator stood up abruptly, snapping his briefcase shut with a sharp, angry click. He informed Logan in a harsh, unforgiving tone that filing a false emergency medical injunction was a severe federal offense, and they would be submitting a formal report regarding his deceptive conduct to the presiding judge immediately. They did not say another word to me. They walked straight out my front door, signaling the sheriff's deputies to stand down and clear the property. Logan remained frozen in my hallway. His face turned a deep, blotchy red, the blood rushing to his cheeks, as the absolute magnitude of his failure crushed his lungs. He stared at me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. The terrifying realization finally locked into his mind. I was entirely aware of his game. I had anticipated his attack and neutralized it before he even stepped onto my porch. The element of surprise was permanently gone. Logan now knew he was trapped in a war he could not survive. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind the departing evaluators, sealing the two of us inside the sudden suffocating quiet of my home. The silence stretched heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of Logan's ragged breathing. I watched the blood slowly recede from his face, replaced by an ashen, rigid pallor. The pristine, respectful son-in-law persona he had so carefully curated for my daughter did not just slip. It shattered completely against the hardwood floor. He realized the medical ambush had failed spectacularly, leaving him with absolutely no legal leverage to seize my estate before the weekend. He stood in my hallway, his shoulders hunching forward, his hands curling into tight, white-knuckled fists. When he finally stepped into the center of my living room, his posture was no longer that of a confident young executive, but of a cornered predator. The calculated, deferential charm evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, venomous malice. He looked at me with a cold, dead stare. He did not bother raising his voice. Instead, his tone dropped into a sharp, vicious register that cut through the quiet air like shattered glass. He dropped the pretense entirely. He acknowledged that my little stunt with the private neurological screening was a clever maneuver, a lucky break that bought me a few extra hours. He sneered at the pristine medical file still resting on my coffee table, mocking the lengths I had to go to just to prove my own sanity in my own home. He stepped so close I could smell the sharp metallic tang of his expensive cologne. He told me that outsmarting a pair of state-appointed bureaucrats changed absolutely nothing about the fundamental reality of our situation. The trap was still closing, and he still held the only key. Logan leaned over the back of my leather sofa, his pale eyes entirely void of any human empathy. He spoke with the chilling absolute certainty of a man who held total psychological dominance over his victim. He explicitly stated that Naomi's mind belonged entirely to him now. He recounted how effortlessly he had manipulated her reality over the past year, isolating her from her friends, twisting her perceptions, and painting me as the ultimate villain in her life. He boasted that he could tell her the sky was burning, and she would immediately close the blinds and thank him for saving her. My daughter, the brilliant, independent woman I had raised, was completely tethered to his manufactured narrative. Logan then laid out his final non-negotiable terms. He demanded that I instantly contact Jonathan and initiate the immediate dissolution of the irrevocable blind trust I had just established. He wanted the keys to the logistics empire, the primary subsidiary accounts, and the deeds to every single commercial warehouse transferred directly into his personal holding company. He promised me that if I did not legally surrender my entire life's work, he would proceed with the wedding exactly as planned. He would stand at the altar, take Naomi's hand, and legally bind her to his sinking ship. The moment the ink dried on their marriage certificate, he would initiate his exit strategy. He described with graphic, sadistic detail how he would drag her to Europe, completely sever her contact with the outside world, and systematically drain her personal trust funds dry to cover his mounting offshore debts. He would leave her stranded in a foreign country, completely deliberately drowning in massive unpayable debt, while he lived comfortably on the stolen capital he had secured under her name. He smiled a thin, cruel stretch of his lips, assuring me that the total destruction of my daughter's sanity and financial future would be my permanent, living legacy if I dared to defy him. He wanted me to imagine her calling me from Geneva begging for a salvation I would no longer be able to afford. I looked at the arrogant, manicured thief standing in my living room, casually threatening to destroy my flesh and blood. I felt a violent, primal urge to shatter his jaw, to physically eject him from my property with the same brutal force he was applying to my family. But I kept my hands resting calmly on the arms of my chair. I remembered the grueling, humiliating years of building my company. I remembered sitting in hostile bank lobbies 3 decades ago, fighting against systemic barriers and blatant redlining just to secure a microscopic business loan. I had faced down institutional monsters who smiled politely while actively trying to suffocate my ambitions because of my background. I had built an empire by outworking and outsmarting men far more dangerous than Logan Pierce. Striking him now would only give him the physical assault charge he desperately needed to validate his victim narrative and push Naomi further away. Instead of yielding to anger, I weaponized my restraint. I looked up at him, letting my shoulders slump slightly to project the illusion of total crushing defeat. I told him that he had won. I agreed to instruct Jonathan to reverse the trust and draft the complete corporate transfer documents. I promised to personally deliver the signed, finalized paperwork directly to him at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. Logan's posture instantly straightened. The cruel tension in his face dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He fully believed he had just witnessed the absolute breaking point of a formidable titan. He had used my deepest vulnerability against me and watched me surrender my empire to protect my child. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine shirt, shooting me a look of profound, mocking pity. He reminded me to wear a nice suit to the rehearsal dinner, treating me not as a defeated rival, but as a subjugated employee receiving a direct order. He turned and walked out the front door, his confident strides echoing across the porch before the heavy engine of his luxury SUV roared to life and faded down the driveway. I stood up from my chair. I walked to the entryway and engaged the heavy steel deadbolt securing the sanctuary of my home. The illusion of my defeat vanished the moment the lock clicked into place. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I bypassed my legal contacts and scrolled directly to the number for Valerie, the premier event coordinator managing the extravagant Pierce wedding weekend. She answered on the second ring, her voice strained from the immense pressure of managing Garrison's demanding wife. I did not ask for a progress report. I spoke with the calm, authoritative tone of a man accustomed to giving absolute directives. I instructed Valerie to immediately bypass the standard venue technicians and hire an independent elite production crew. I ordered her to drastically upgrade the entire audio-visual system for the rehearsal dinner. I demanded crystal-clear acoustic projection, discrete ambient room monitors, hidden wireless microphones, synchronized to the head table, and a seamless, uncrackable integration with the venue's primary surround sound speaker array. I authorized a blank check for the equipment and told her the setup had to be flawless, completely invisible to the guests, but powerful enough to broadcast a whisper to the entire banquet hall. I was going to give Logan Pierce the grand, unforgettable audience he so desperately craved, and I was going to ensure that every single one of his high society guests heard exactly what he truly was. The evening air was crisp as the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a golden hue through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard Hotel's grand ballroom. It was the most exclusive venue in the metropolitan area, boasting imported marble floors, cascading crystal chandeliers, and an acoustic architecture designed for symphony orchestras. I had paid the exorbitant invoice for the entire evening in full 3 months ago, down to the imported silk napkins and the vintage champagne currently flowing freely into the glasses of the local elite. The room was packed with city councilmen, real estate developers, and high society socialites all gathered to witness the rehearsal dinner of the season. At the center of this opulent display stood Garrison Pierce. He was working the room with the practiced ease of a career politician, shaking hands, slapping shoulders, and projecting the absolute illusion of a billionaire patriarch. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that masked the desperate reality of a man teetering on the edge of federal indictment and total financial ruin. Watching him laugh and clink glasses with investors he had likely defrauded was a masterclass in sociopathic composure. He was entirely in his element, a parasitic organism thriving in an ecosystem of fabricated wealth. The catering staff moved silently through the crowd, carrying trays of seared wagyu and caviar, all financed by the logistics empire he was actively attempting to steal. I stood in the shadowed alcove near the coat check, observing the grotesque theater of it all. Valerie, the event coordinator, caught my eye from across the hall and gave a microscopic, affirming nod. The upgraded, discrete audio-visual system I had commissioned was fully integrated and actively monitoring the primary microphone channels. The stage was perfectly set. I stepped out of the shadows and entered the ballroom, walking with the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who held the absolute high ground. I was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, discarding the usual heavy work boots and dispatch jackets of my daily routine for a visual armor suited for the occasion. The heavy fabric settled perfectly across my shoulders, projecting an undeniable authority that immediately drew the eyes of the guests nearest the entrance. The polite chatter in my immediate vicinity momentarily dipped as I navigated the sea of silk and expensive cologne. It did not take long for the architect of my supposed downfall to intercept me. Logan detached himself from a group of junior executives and moved swiftly toward the foyer, blocking my path to the main dining area. The polite, deferential son-in-law mask was completely gone, replaced by the twitchy, arrogant energy of a thief who believed he had successfully cornered his mark. He did not offer a greeting. He did not extend a hand in welcome. He stepped directly into my personal space, his eyes darting frantically toward my hands. He aggressively held out his right palm, his fingers twitching with greedy anticipation. He demanded the legal documents in a harsh, impatient whisper, instructing me to hand over the corporate transfer files immediately so he could secure them in his vehicle before the dinner formally commenced. He reeked of entitlement and expensive scotch, entirely convinced that the medical ambush he had orchestrated yesterday had broken my spirit and forced my absolute submission. I looked down at his outstretched hand, noting the slight tremor in his fingers. It was the tremor of a man whose entire fabricated existence depended entirely on the signature of the man he was attempting to destroy. He leaned closer, his voice dropping an octave, reminding me of the ultimatum he had delivered in my living room. He sneered that my presence was only tolerated to finalize the transaction, warning me not to stall or create a scene in front of his father's prestigious guests. He wanted the keys to the logistics empire, the blind trust dissolved, and the absolute surrender of my legacy right there in the foyer. I did not flinch, nor did I reach for the paperwork he so desperately craved. I simply raised my hand and firmly patted the breast pocket of my charcoal suit. I felt the sharp edges of the heavy, unredacted federal fraud files and the flash drive resting securely against my chest. I looked him dead in the eye and assured him in a calm, unwavering tone that the papers were entirely safe and that he would receive exactly what he deserved before the night was over. Logan's jaw tightened, but he withdrew his hand, unwilling to risk a public altercation. I stepped around him, leaving him standing in the foyer, and walked toward the head of the family table. Naomi was already seated. She wore a stunning emerald evening gown, but her posture was rigid, defensive. As I approached and took the seat designated for the father of the bride, she stubbornly refused to look at me. She kept her eyes strictly fixed on the porcelain plate in front of her, her jaw clenched, actively ignoring the man who had spent 28 years shielding her from the very kind of predators she was about to marry. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of fine silverware filled the grand ballroom as the first course was cleared. The guests settled into their seats, the champagne flowing freely, completely unaware of the massive legal and financial traps hidden beneath the surface of the evening. Suddenly, the sharp, clear ring of a silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute echoed across the room. Garrison Pierce stood at the center of the head table, holding his glass high. He tapped the crystal twice more, commanding the attention of the entire room. The elite crowd immediately fell silent, turning their faces toward the patriarch of the Pierce family. Garrison adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, projecting an air of profound, benevolent authority. He smiled warmly at the audience, his teeth gleaming under the cascading chandeliers. He leaned into the microphone, his deep, practiced voice booming through the upgraded, crystal-clear audio system Valerie had installed at my exact directive. Garrison began to deliver a highly pompous, aggressively arrogant speech about legacy tradition and the historic union of two great families. He spoke eloquently about the future, raising his glass to Logan and Naomi, praising their love and dedication. But the true venom of his speech lay in his underlying corporate message. He smoothly transitioned into a thinly veiled victory lap, openly boasting to his defrauded investors about the merging of two powerful business empires. He spoke of new logistics avenues, massive capital expansions, and a glorious financial future, practically declaring his hostile takeover a complete success right to my face. He stood there bankrupt and facing federal prison, using my money to feed his guests while publicly claiming ownership of the legacy I had bled to build. Garrison leaned closer to the silver microphone stand, letting his deep baritone wash over the captivated audience of elite socialites and politicians. He spoke of the Pierce family name as if it were a monument carved in granite, waxing poetic about generational wealth, untarnished honor, and the heavy responsibilities of preserving a dynasty. He raised his crystal champagne flute toward Logan, his eyes gleaming with the manic energy of a man who believed he had just cheated death. He publicly praised his son for his exceptional business acumen, loudly commending him for bridging two great families and single-handedly securing their financial future for the next century. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause, fully buying into the illusion of a triumphant corporate merger. I sat at the head of the family table, watching the performance with clinical detachment. The sheer audacity of his lies in a room full of people he was actively defrauding was staggering. As the applause began to wane and Garrison prepared to deliver his final sickening toast, I placed my linen napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. The heavy charcoal fabric of my suit shifted as I drew myself to my full height. The movement caught the attention of the surrounding guests, causing a ripple of confused murmurs to spread through the immediate vicinity. Garrison paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he noticed me standing. He thought I was yielding to the pressure rising to offer a public concession of my estate. I did not look at him. I turned to a passing waiter carrying a silver tray of fresh champagne flutes and calmly instructed him to bring me a wireless microphone. The waiter blinked in surprise but quickly signaled the production crew. Within seconds, a sleek black microphone was placed directly into my hand. I turned my back to Garrison and the sea of expectant wealthy faces, directing my attention entirely to the woman seated quietly at my left. Naomi kept her eyes locked on the table, her jaw tight, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge my presence. I spoke into the microphone, my voice completely devoid of the anger or the bitterness Logan had promised her I would display. I told her that I loved her more than life itself. I reminded her of the decades I had spent building a fortress around her, ensuring she would never have to experience the desperation or the crushing vulnerability that had defined my own youth. I stated clearly and calmly that my absolute duty as her father was to protect her independence, which was exactly why I flatly refused to stand by and watch her be sold to a family of desperate thieves. Naomi's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide, flashing with immediate defensive anger. She opened her mouth to argue, fully prepared to recite the script Logan had drilled into her mind. Before she could utter a single syllable, I raised my free hand and gestured directly toward the shadowed sound booth at the far end of the grand ballroom. Valerie stood behind the mixing console, her hand hovering over the primary control board. She caught my signal and immediately pressed the playback button. I had provided her with the raw, unedited digital audio file extracted directly from the hidden surveillance system I had installed weeks ago. The discrete ambient room monitors and the massive high-definition speaker array I had commissioned specifically for this exact moment roared to life. The audio did not begin with a gentle introduction. It started abruptly, cutting through the heavy silence of the banquet hall with crystal-clear, undeniable acoustic precision. It was the distinct, arrogant voice of Logan Pierce echoing from the courtroom of my estate just days prior. The sound was so crisp and so impeccably projected that it felt as if Logan were standing in the center of the room, speaking directly into the ears of every single guest. The recording captured Logan's frantic pacing, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood floor. Garrison's voice joined the playback, heavy with panic and malice, completely stripped of his public aristocratic charm. He demanded to know if Logan had secured the girl. Logan replied with a cruel, dismissive laugh, confirming that Naomi was completely under his control and entirely oblivious to their reality. The high-definition speakers broadcasted Garrison explicitly detailing the $15 million shortfall in his investment firm, the impending Securities and Exchange Commission indictments, and the absolute total bankruptcy of the Pierce estate. The audio proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had targeted my family with surgical precision. Garrison's recorded voice instructed his son to use the marriage license to access my logistics company's primary corporate accounts. He outlined their malicious plan to liquidate my assets, drain Naomi's personal trust funds to cover their massive offshore debts, and leave her legally bound to their federal crimes while they escaped the fallout. They spoke about my daughter not as a bride, but as an expendable financial asset. The recorded conversation bounced off the imported marble floors and the vaulted, acoustically perfected ceilings of the grand ballroom. The sound surrounded the guests, inescapable and utterly damning. Garrison Pierce stood frozen behind his podium, his crystal champagne flute slipping from his trembling fingers. It hit the floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, but the sound was completely drowned out by his own recorded voice, confessing to massive federal wire fraud. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The polished billionaire patriarch persona disintegrated in real time, exposing the terrified, cornered criminal hiding underneath. Across the room, Logan was completely paralyzed. His manicured hands gripped the edge of his table with such force that his knuckles turned white. His mouth hung slightly open. his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors, realizing he was entirely surrounded by the very investors and local politicians his father had just admitted to defrauding. He looked at Naomi, but she was not looking at him. She was staring at the speakers. Her breath caught in her throat, the horrific realization of her fiancé's true nature crashing down upon her. The affluent guests, previously buzzing with polite conversation and high society gossip, sat in absolute horrified silence. Councilmen stared at the head table in shock. Real estate developers slowly lowered their glasses, their expressions shifting from polite interest to outright revulsion. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply listened to the undeniable proof of the Pierce family's criminal enterprise echoing through the most exclusive venue in the city. The trap I had set had snapped shut with flawless, brutal precision, locking the thieves in a public cage of their own making. Logan's paralysis broke the moment the final damning syllable of his own recorded voice faded into the vaulted ceiling. He lunged forward, nearly knocking over his own dining chair, and screamed toward the shadowed sound booth at the back of the ballroom. He demanded the audio be cut instantly, his voice cracking with a frantic, desperate shrillness that completely shattered his composed executive facade. He spun around to face the audience of horrified politicians and silent investors, his arms waving wildly as he launched into a furious improvised defense. He shouted that the recording was an absolute fabrication, a malicious, artificially generated deep fake commissioned by a severely paranoid father attempting to sabotage his daughter's happiness. He pointed an accusatory finger at me, sweating profusely, claiming I had hired digital criminals to synthesize his voice in a pathetic effort to frame his family. The elite crowd did not murmur in agreement. They remained entirely still, paralyzed by the sheer desperation of his performance. Realizing he was losing the room, Logan pivoted abruptly toward Naomi. He needed to secure his primary asset. He rushed around the edge of the head table, his hand reaching aggressively to grab her bare arm, intending to physically drag her out of the ballroom and away from the undeniable truth. He commanded her to stand up, insisting they leave the toxic environment immediately. He never made contact with her skin. I stepped smoothly and solidly between them, planting my heavy frame directly in his path. I did not raise my hands, but the sheer, unmovable physical barrier of my presence forced him to a jarring halt. I stared down at him, my expression completely void of mercy, locking him firmly in his place. Logan's chest heaved as he stood inches from me, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a way around my defense. I did not blink. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and slowly withdrew a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents. I turned my back on Logan, completely dismissing his fabricated outrage, and handed the first heavy parcel directly to my daughter. Naomi's hands were trembling as she took the papers, her eyes dropping to the high-resolution time-stamped photographs printed on the first page. I spoke in a calm, carrying voice, ensuring the silence of the ballroom magnified every single word. I told her that I loved her with an intensity that surpassed my own life, and because of that absolute devotion, I utterly refused to let her be sold as collateral to a family of desperate thieves. Naomi stared at the photographs extracted directly from Vanguard Capital's high-definition security feeds. The images clearly displayed Logan sitting shoulder to shoulder with Eris, holding a gold pen and aggressively forging her specific signature onto a predatory loan application. She flipped the page, finding the certified bank logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable printout of the first-class one-way flight itinerary to Geneva, booked exclusively in Logan's name for the morning immediately following their scheduled wedding ceremony. The digital AI defense Logan had just screamed to the room instantly evaporated. Artificial intelligence could not synthesize verified bank ledgers or federal transaction timestamps. Naomi traced the forged ink on the pages, the cognitive dissonance that had clouded her judgment for months, shattering completely against the raw, irrefutable evidence of her fiancé's financial treason. Logan realized what she was holding. A guttural sound of pure panic escaped his throat, and he lunged forward, desperately attempting to snatch the documents from her trembling hands. I did not let him reach her. I brought my hand down with bone-jarring force, swatting his wrist away with a sharp, heavy strike that echoed like a gunshot across the marble floor. Logan stumbled backward, clutching his arm, his pristine, arrogant facade utterly destroyed by the reality of his failure. Leaving Logan humiliated beside the table, I shifted my focus entirely to the patriarch of the crumbling empire. Garrison Pierce was still standing paralyzed behind his podium, staring at the shattered remains of his crystal champagne flute. Decades ago, when I was fighting tooth and nail to expand my initial fleet, Garrison's elite banking colleagues had literally laughed me out of their corporate lobbies. They had looked at a young, exhausted man fighting systemic barriers and redlining and casually dismissed me as a terrible investment. They had denied me capital out of pure aristocratic prejudice. I had never forgotten the condescension in their boardrooms. I reached into my coat and pulled out the second stack of verified documents, tossing them aggressively onto the linen tablecloth right in front of Garrison. It was a formal, expedited notice of absolute foreclosure. I announced, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the ballroom, that I had utilized the massive liquid cash reserves of my logistics empire to purchase the entirety of his toxic defaulted offshore corporate debt yesterday afternoon. I was now his sole creditor, and I was foreclosing on his historic estate and every remaining shell company immediately. The sheer crushing gravity of total financial ruin hit Garrison's chest with the force of a physical blow. The air emptied from his lungs. He stumbled blindly backward, his legs failing beneath the weight of his public destruction. He crashed violently into a towering catering display behind the head table. The heavy wooden structure buckled under his collapsing frame, sending 3 tiers of imported champagne bottles and crystal glassware cascading onto the imported marble floor. The deafening crash of shattering glass ripped through the silent ballroom, a chaotic, violent punctuation to the absolute bankruptcy of the Pierce family dynasty. Several wealthy socialites shrieked, jumping back as shards of crystal skittered across the floor, while local politicians stared in muted horror at the fallen patriarch lying amidst the wreckage. Logan stared at his father thrashing in the spilled champagne, and whatever was left of his manicured sanity snapped entirely. His face contorted into a mask of pure feral hatred, the veins in his neck bulging against the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face, screaming over the murmurs of the stunned crowd. He spit venomous, unhinged threats, promising to tie my company up in endless litigation, vowing to burn my logistics empire to the ground, and swearing he would destroy everything I had ever built. He was a cornered animal backed into an inescapable cage of his own design, lashing out with the desperate, empty threats of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I stood perfectly still amidst the chaos, looking at the broken thieves, knowing the final execution of my defense was already in motion. Naomi stood completely still beside the head table, the heavy stack of banking records and flight itineraries trembling in her hands. The deafening crash of Garrison destroying the catering display behind her did not break her focus. Logan's frantic, unhinged screaming directed at the sound booth barely registered in her ears. Her eyes remained locked on the undeniable, ink-stained proof of her own impending destruction. She stared at the signature on the multi-million-dollar predatory loan application. It was a flawless replication of her own handwriting, executed by the man who had kissed her forehead and sworn to protect her just hours ago. The thick, suffocating fog of psychological manipulation that Logan had spent the last year carefully pumping into her mind evaporated in a single, devastating instant. The isolation, the manufactured paranoia, the tearful claims of my supposed sabotage, all crystallized into a singular, horrifying truth. She had been nothing more than a blind, heavily mortgaged pawn in a massive corporate theft. Naomi slowly lowered the documents to the linen tablecloth. She turned to face Logan. He was wildly shouting that the audio was an artificial intelligence fake, pointing his shaking finger at me, completely consumed by his own desperate lies. He rushed toward her, reaching out to grab her arm to drag her away from the truth. Naomi did not retreat. She stepped forward, planting her feet firmly against the marble floor, and swung her arm with every ounce of physical strength she possessed. The open palm of her hand struck Logan's face with a violent, bone-rattling crack that severed the tension in the grand ballroom like a whip. The sheer force of the impact snapped his head violently to the side, instantly silencing his manic defense. Before he could even register the physical shock, Naomi reached for her left hand. She brutally ripped the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring from her finger and hurled it directly into his chest. The heavy stone struck his tuxedo lapel and clattered uselessly onto the floor, rolling away into the spilled champagne. The sharp, stinging echo of the slap hung in the opulent air of the Vanguard Hotel ballroom. Logan slowly turned his face back toward Naomi. The bright red imprint of her hand was already blooming across his pale cheek. The charming, deferential son-in-law persona he had weaponized for 12 months disintegrated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, vicious shell of a man. Logan's eyes darkened with a feral, unrestrained malice. He completely dropped the facade. He stepped toward her, his voice erupting into a hateful, guttural scream that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He called her pathetic. He called her a naive, incredibly stupid little girl who was entirely too easy to manipulate. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of any sanity, as he explicitly detailed exactly how simple it had been to turn her against her own father. He boasted about isolating her from her friends, feeding her manufactured lies, and watching her blindly swallow every piece of bait he offered. He paced in front of the head table, loudly declaring to the horrified audience of socialites and politicians that he had never felt a single fraction of an ounce of love for her. He explicitly stated that her presence repulsed him and that he had only tolerated her endless emotional neediness because she was the direct biological key to a logistics empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He screamed that she was nothing more than an asset, a temporary stepping stone required to liquidate her father's cash reserves and cover the massive offshore debts his own family had incurred. He berated her for actually believing a man of his pedigree could ever truly love someone from her background. The venom pouring from his mouth was absolute and unfiltered. He wanted to break her spirit right there in front of the city's elite, actively trying to inflict as much psychological damage as possible before his inevitable arrest. The wealthy guests watched the total unmasking of a sociopath, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his confession. Every single lie he had told her was stripped away, leaving Naomi standing in the wreckage of her entire life, staring at a monster. Logan's chest heaved rapidly as he finished verbally slaughtering the woman he had promised to marry. His chest rose and fell with frantic, erratic breaths. The absolute destruction of his grand master plan, combined with the public humiliation of Naomi's rejection, pushed his fractured ego entirely past the point of rational thought. He needed a physical target to absorb the crushing weight of his monumental failure. He locked his crazed eyes directly onto me. With a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated hatred, the arrogant thief lunged forward across the slick marble floor. He drew his right arm back, balling his manicured hand into a tight fist, aiming a wild, desperate punch squarely at my jaw. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to block his strike. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid. I looked at the fragile, desperate boy hurtling toward me and remembered the grueling reality of my own existence. I had spent 3 decades hauling heavy industrial freight, freezing on midnight loading docks and breaking my back to lay the physical concrete foundations of my logistics empire. My physical frame was forged from decades of relentless, punishing manual labor. Logan had spent his entire life swinging golf clubs and holding crystal champagne flutes. I knew with absolute certainty that he lacked the actual functional strength to cause me any genuine physical harm. I stood perfectly still, watching his fists sail through the air, fully prepared to absorb the pathetic impact. The heavy strike never connected. A fraction of a second before Logan's knuckles could graze the fabric of my charcoal suit, a deafening, thunderous crash erupted at the far end of the ballroom. The massive, double-sided solid oak doors of the Vanguard Hotel's main entrance did not simply open. They were violently kicked inward, slamming against the interior walls with a concussive boom that rattled the crystal fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Logan froze, his arm suspended midair, the pure shock of the noise instantly severing his adrenaline-fueled rage. Every head in the grand banquet hall snapped toward the foyer. The polished, suffocating atmosphere of the high society rehearsal dinner was instantly annihilated by the arrival of absolute, uncompromising federal authority. 6 heavily armed agents marched through the threshold in a tight, synchronized tactical formation. They wore stark, dark windbreakers with thick, bold yellow lettering stretched across their backs and chests, explicitly identifying them as the Elite Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by sworn agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not pause to scan the crowd. They did not ask for permission to enter the private event. They moved with a terrifying, predatory efficiency, their heavy tactical boots striking the imported marble floors in perfect unison. They bypassed the terrified local politicians and the cowering real estate developers, their eyes locked precisely on the head table. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe, uncompromising expression, raised his hand and pointed directly at the shattered patriarch still bleeding on the floor. and the manicured thief standing frozen with his fist in the air. The element of surprise was entirely absolute. The trap had closed completely, and the executioners had finally arrived to collect their absolute due. The lead agent did not raise his voice yet. The absolute authority in his tone commanded the sprawling ballroom with the force of a physical blow. He introduced himself as Special Agent Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating in joint coordination with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He gestured sharply, and the 5 agents flanking him instantly fanned out, forming an impenetrable tactical perimeter around the shattered remains of the head table. Garrison Pierce remained slumped against the ruined catering display, his custom tuxedo soaked in vintage champagne and stained with the remnants of caviar, staring up at the federal badges with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Vance reached into the interior pocket of his dark windbreaker and produced a heavily folded stack of thick-sealed documents. He unrolled the federal warrant with a crisp snap of the paper, reading the charges aloud for the entire assembly of high society guests to hear. He explicitly cited multiple counts of felony wire fraud, systemic corporate embezzlement conspiracy to commit extortion, and the malicious forgery of federal financial documents. The clinical legal terminology echoed off the imported marble, stripping away the final shreds of the Pierce family's fabricated aristocratic armor. Logan, still standing mere feet from my daughter, began to tremble uncontrollably. His manicured hands shook as he looked from the heavily armed federal agents back to the terrified faces of the investors his father had spent the evening courting. He tried to speak, attempting to summon the arrogant, untouchable executive persona that had defined his entire existence, but his throat produced nothing but a pathetic, breathless wheeze. The illusion of their absolute power had evaporated entirely, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of a federal indictment. The tactical team closed the distance, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts, completely neutralizing any remaining threat in the room. I stepped forward, closing the space between myself and the crumbling patriarch. I looked down at Garrison, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the agonizingly silent ballroom. I informed him that the element of surprise was the only true currency in a hostile takeover. I explicitly revealed that the moment I secured Aris's heavily encrypted ledger and the high-definition security footage of Logan forging Naomi's signature, I did not confront them directly. Instead, I had personally delivered the entire unredacted digital portfolio directly to the district attorney exactly 48 hours ago. I explained that while they were busy selecting the imported silk napkins and tasting the caviar for this opulent rehearsal dinner, federal prosecutors were already freezing their offshore accounts, seizing their remaining shell companies, and drafting the very arrest warrants currently being executed in this room. The realization hit Garrison with the devastating force of a physical strike. He hauled himself up from the champagne-soaked floor, his hands bleeding from the shattered crystal, and turned desperately toward the crowd. He locked eyes with a group of prominent city councilmen and elite real estate developers, men he had dined with, golfed with, and heavily lobbied for over a decade. He begged them to intervene, his voice cracking as he pleaded for someone to make a phone call to pull a political string to vouch for his supposedly untarnished character. The response was an absolute chilling void. The politicians physically turned their backs on him. The developers deliberately averted their eyes, clutching their drinks and retreating toward the edges of the ballroom as if the Pierce family were carrying a highly contagious disease. They were terrified of the radioactive fallout of a federal fraud case, instantly abandoning the sinking ship to protect their own reputations and political careers. Garrison stood entirely alone, a ghost in a room full of people he had paid to attend his own coronation. The absolute betrayal mirrored his own ruthless tactics, leaving him entirely isolated. He turned back to me, his face twisting into a mask of pure agony, finally realizing that the logistical empire he had sought to steal had completely buried him under a mountain of undeniable legal concrete. The sudden, suffocating reality of federal prison finally shattered Logan's paralysis. Driven by the sheer primal panic of a cornered animal, he spun around and bolted blindly toward the swinging doors of the kitchen service exit. He shoved a terrified waiter out of his path, his expensive dress shoes slipping wildly on the polished marble. He did not make it past the serving stations. I watched him run with clinical detachment, remembering the grueling years I spent clawing my way up from the shipping docks. 30 years ago, I had learned the hard way that when dealing with corrupt union bosses and ruthless freight barons, you never leave a single exit unguarded. I had built my entire empire by anticipating the desperation of cornered men. 2 federal agents detached from the perimeter with terrifying speed. They intercepted Logan effortlessly, driving their shoulders into his chest and tackling him hard to the floor. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs in a sharp gasp. They pinned him against the cold marble, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. The heavy metallic snap of steel handcuffs locking securely over his pristine manicured wrists echoed loudly, officially finalizing the termination of his freedom. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled elite as the agents hauled Logan roughly to his feet. His tailored suit was torn and covered in dust from the floor, his hair plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. He thrashed against the iron grip of the federal officers, screaming a barrage of frantic, incoherent threats that dissolved into pathetic sobs as they forcibly marched him toward the main foyer. Garrison was pulled to his feet with equal lack of ceremony, his hands secured tightly behind his back. The broken patriarch hung his head, utterly defeated, offering zero resistance as he was paraded past the very investors he had sought to bleed dry. The affluent guests began to whisper furiously, the shock breaking into a wave of manic, horrified gossip as the reality of the scandal set in. Cell phones were discreetly pulled from designer purses as the city's upper crust scrambled to text their financial advisors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive crater of the Pierce family's collapse. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the departing agent, sealing the absolute destruction of the grand merger. I stood beside the head table, the chaotic noise of the room washing over me. The venomous threat that had loomed over my family for the past 12 months had been surgically eradicated. I turned slowly to look at Naomi. She stood perfectly still amidst the ruins, staring at the empty space where her fiancé had just been dragged away in irons. The illusion of her perfect life had been violently ripped away, leaving her to face the harsh, unvarnished truth of her survival. The heavy oak doors swung shut, and with them went the last remnants of the Pierce family's fabricated empire. The exodus of the city's elite was swift and entirely unceremonious. Councilmen, real estate developers, and high society socialites scrambled for the coat check, desperate to evacuate the Vanguard Hotel ballroom before any lingering taint of federal indictment could attach to their own reputations or political careers. Within minutes, the sprawling, opulent space was reduced to a cavernous echo chamber. The frantic whispers and the hurried clicking of expensive heels faded down the marble corridors, leaving behind a stark, contrasting silence. I stood near the head table, the sole architect of the evening's destruction, surveying the battlefield. The imported silk napkins lay crumpled on the floor. Untouched plates of seared wagyu and caviar rested on pristine linen tablecloths, rapidly cooling under the brilliant glare of the crystal chandeliers. Pools of vintage champagne soaked into the imported rugs, mixing with the shattered remains of Garrison's crystal flute. The adrenaline that had fueled my absolute precision over the past 48 hours finally began to recede, leaving behind the heavy, familiar ache of exhaustion in my shoulders. I turned my attention fully to my daughter. Naomi stood exactly where she had been when the federal agents breached the room. Her emerald evening gown seemed too large for her suddenly fragile frame. The rigid defensive posture Logan had drilled into her was completely gone. She stared at the empty space by the foyer, her chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths, as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal finally pierced her state of shock. The realization hit her with the physical force of a tidal wave. Her knees buckled. Naomi collapsed heavily into one of the gilded dining chairs, burying her face in her hands as violent, uncontrollable sobs racked her entire body. I walked slowly around the wreckage of the shattered catering display, my heavy footsteps echoing in the vast, empty ballroom. I pulled out the chair directly beside her and sat down. I did not speak. I did not offer a single platitude about how things would eventually be fine, nor did I utter the toxic, vindictive phrase that so many parents default to in moments of vindication. There would be no lectures about obedience, no stern reprimands about her failure to see through Logan's manipulations, and absolutely no variations of telling her I was right all along. She was bleeding internally, her entire perception of reality violently torn apart by the man she had loved and trusted. Punishing her for being the victim of a calculated psychological assault was entirely against my nature. Instead, I simply reached out and wrapped my heavy, calloused arm around her trembling shoulders. I pulled her gently against my chest, shielding her from the cold emptiness of the massive room. Naomi instinctively leaned into the embrace, gripping the lapels of my charcoal suit exactly as she used to grab my work shirts when she was a terrified child waking up from a nightmare. her tears soaked through the expensive fabric, hot and desperate, carrying the agonizing weight of shattered illusions and deep, profound humiliation. She cried for the wedding that was nothing more than a highly orchestrated financial trap. She cried for the months she had spent actively pushing away the only man who truly had her best interests at heart. I held her firmly, anchoring her to the present reality while the storm of her grief washed over us. I let her cry until her throat was raw and her breathing eventually slowed to a ragged, exhausted rhythm. My physical presence was the only tether keeping her from completely drifting into the abyss of Logan's psychological destruction. I rested my chin on the top of her head, staring out over the empty tables and the abandoned crystal glasses. I knew the silence we shared was not a void, but a crucial, sterile space required for the initial stages of healing. I had neutralized the immediate threat and secured her physical safety, but the emotional extraction was a process that could not be rushed by corporate maneuvers or federal warrants. I simply held my daughter in the ruins of the rehearsal dinner, serving as the solid, immovable wall she needed to lean against while her world reassembled itself. When her sobs finally subsided into quiet, trembling breaths, I broke the silence. I kept my voice low, speaking with the steady, measured cadence of a man who had rebuilt his life from total wreckage more than once. I told her that the process of tearing down a compromised structure is incredibly painful, but it is the absolute only way to ensure the ground is clear for something permanent. I explained that a strong foundation poured properly and allowed to set never cracks twice. I gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look directly at me. I reminded her of the woman who had given her those striking, defiant eyes. Her mother had faced terminal illness with a fierce, uncompromising grace, staring down her own mortality without ever once letting fear dictate her actions or her spirit. I told Naomi that she carried that exact same indestructible resilience in her blood. She was not defined by the temporary blindness inflicted by a pathetic con artist. She was defined by the deep, enduring strength she had inherited from a woman who helped build our family from absolutely nothing. Naomi sniffled, using the back of her hand to wipe the smeared makeup from her cheeks. She slowly turned her gaze toward the heavy stack of legal documents still resting on the linen tablecloth. The bank logs, the forged signatures, and the notice of absolute foreclosure sat there as physical testaments to the sheer scale of the war I had waged on her behalf. She reached out and touched the edge of the Vanguard Capital file, her eyes widening as the true scope of my counteroffensive finally registered in her exhausted mind. She realized that I had not merely hired a lawyer to file a simple injunction. I had actively liquidated massive portions of my own logistics empire, weaponizing my life's work and heavily leveraging my assets to purchase Garrison's toxic debt and force a federal intervention. I had risked my personal freedom, my corporate sovereignty, and the entirety of my legacy, all to throw myself blindly onto the tracks to stop the train that was about to run her over. Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not born of grief or betrayal. They were born of absolute, humbling clarity. She looked up at me, her voice barely a whisper, and apologized with a profound, shattering sincerity for ever doubting my intentions and for allowing Logan's poison to infect her mind. I squeezed her shoulder one last time, accepting the apology without the need for further words. I stood up, offering her my hand. She took it, rising steadily to her feet. Together we turned our backs on the spilled champagne, the ruined banquet, and the shattered glass. We walked out of the silent ballroom, leaving the absolute ruins of the Pierce dynasty behind us, completely ready to build something entirely new. 3 weeks evaporated into a whirlwind of relentless legal execution. I sat behind the heavy mahogany desk in my study, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stacks of federal indictments and foreclosure notices spread before me. The Vanguard Hotel incident had triggered a massive financial earthquake, and I was methodically managing the shockwaves. The absolute destruction of the Pierce estate was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a rapidly accelerating reality. My private phone rang with a persistent, desperate rhythm. Garrison's high-priced defense lawyers had been attempting to breach my legal firewall all week. They were frantically trying to bypass the district attorney and negotiate a quiet, confidential settlement directly with me. They wanted to leverage my newly acquired position as their sole primary creditor to stall the asset seizures. Their voicemails were masterpieces of corporate groveling, offering fractional repayments, equity in hollowed-out subsidiaries, and desperate pleas for professional clemency. They completely failed to understand that I was not a rival businessman looking for a profitable acquisition. I was a father systematically dismantling the threat to his family. I listened to the latest voicemail from their lead counsel, a man whose arrogant tone had dissolved into a breathless, panicked rush. He suggested that pushing Garrison into total bankruptcy would destabilize the local market, warning me of the collateral damage to my own investments. I deleted the message before he even finished his sentence. I had no interest in their hollow compromises or their pathetic attempts at financial diplomacy. I picked up the receiver and dialed Jonathan, my chief legal counsel, skipping the pleasantries entirely. The time for negotiations had officially expired the moment Logan forged my daughter's signature. I instructed Jonathan to formally reject every single settlement offer the Pierce legal team presented. I demanded that he initiate the immediate, merciless liquidation of every asset attached to Garrison's defaulted corporate debt. I wanted absolutely nothing left of their fabricated dynasty to survive the week. Jonathan moved with the ruthless efficiency I had paid for. The dismantling of the Pierce empire became a highly visible public spectacle of absolute financial ruin. Garrison's historic sprawling mansion, the very estate where they had mocked me and meticulously planned my daughter's destruction, was seized under federal authority. It did not go to a private, dignified sale behind closed doors. I ensured it was listed at a highly publicized public auction, transforming their most prized status symbol into a humiliating local media circus. The local news channels broadcasted the event live, capturing the stark reality of the Pierce family's absolute collapse. Bidders walked through their vaulted halls, casually inspecting the imported chandeliers and custom stonework that had been entirely financed by stolen capital. The final hammer fell, transferring the deed to a commercial developer at a fraction of its perceived value. The humiliation did not stop at the real estate. Their fleet of luxury vehicles, the physical manifestations of their fabricated wealth, met an equally unceremonious end. Heavily armored tow trucks arrived at the estate under the cover of early morning darkness, accompanied by bank representatives and local deputies. The pristine SUVs and imported sports cars Logan had driven with such arrogant entitlement were aggressively winched onto flatbeds and repossessed. I watched the aerial footage provided by the local news networks as the vehicles were hauled away to municipal impound lots. The visual armor they had used to intimidate and manipulate the city's elite was systematically stripped away, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of their own criminality. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their impending federal trials. I felt no pity as the reports rolled in. My focus remained entirely on erasing their footprint from the earth. The massive capital generated from the aggressive liquidation of the Pierce estate did not simply sit idle in a corporate holding account. I had a very specific immediate destination for those funds. I directed Jonathan to wire the newly acquired cash straight to the predatory lenders Logan had used to secure his offshore debts. We systematically targeted every single fraudulent loan and unauthorized credit line he had illegally opened using Naomi's forged signature. I remembered the early days of building my logistics company, sitting across from dismissive loan officers, fighting desperately to maintain a clean financial record so I could provide a stable roof over my family's head. I knew exactly how a ruined credit history could completely suffocate a young person's future and bind them to poverty. Within 48 hours, every illicit balance was paid in full, the accounts were permanently closed, and the corresponding fraud reports were filed with the federal authorities. I effectively scrubbed Naomi's financial identity perfectly clean, severing the final invisible chains Logan had tried to wrap around her life. Her independence was completely restored, guaranteed by the very empire he had attempted to steal. The final piece of correspondence from the ruins of the Pierce family arrived at the end of the week. It was not a legal summons or a bank notice. It was a standard manila envelope stamped with the stark blue ink of a federal correctional facility. I sliced the top open with a silver letter opener and pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was erratic, the letters violently slanted and frantic, a severe contrast to the pristine, confident signatures I had seen on his fraudulent contracts. It was a letter directly from Logan, drafted from the confines of his maximum security holding cell. The arrogance that had defined his existence was entirely eradicated, replaced by the pathetic, sniveling desperation of a man staring down decades of hard federal time. He begged me for a professional character reference. He pleaded for me to contact the sentencing judge and offer a statement of leniency, claiming that he was deeply remorseful and merely a misguided victim of his father's overbearing influence. He actually dared to invoke Naomi's name, asking me to consider the love they once shared as grounds for mercy. He wanted me to save him from the exact destruction he had maliciously planned for my daughter. I read the pathetic rambling words without a single ounce of empathy. I did not write a response. I did not forward it to my legal team. I grasped the top and bottom of the lined paper and pulled my hands apart, tearing the letter perfectly and deliberately in half. I dropped the severed pieces directly into the heavy metal trash can beside my desk. The silence in my study was absolute, unbroken, and serene. The dust of the Pierce family's catastrophic implosion eventually settled, leaving a completely redefined landscape in its wake. The state court proceedings were swift and merciless, driven by the absolute mountain of forensic financial evidence I had provided to the district attorney. A federal judge formally annulled every single legal tie Logan had attempted to establish, permanently invalidating the forged proxy documents and predatory loans he had maliciously filed under my daughter's name. His frantic attempts to legally anchor himself to my logistics empire were entirely severed, completely erasing his toxic footprint from our financial records. The immediate threat was eliminated, but the true victory lay in the transformation that occurred within my own family. Naomi did not simply retreat into the comfort of her restored freedom. The brutal reality of her near destruction forged a completely new, unbreakable resilience within her. She recognized that ignorance had been her greatest vulnerability, and she systematically eradicated it. She enrolled in advanced corporate finance seminars and spent hours with Jonathan dissecting the intricate legal frameworks of my business operations. When the dust fully cleared, Naomi stepped forward not as a sheltered heir, but as an active, fiercely educated voting member on the board of directors for our newly secured irrevocable blind trust. She reviewed every quarterly ledger with a sharp, uncompromising eye, actively questioning acquisitions and demanding absolute transparency from our financial officers. The naive girl who had been so easily manipulated by a polished predator was gone forever. In her place stood a formidable, fiercely independent woman who fundamentally understood the true weight and responsibility of her own legacy. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she became the absolute guardian of our family's future. The heavy, oppressive tension that had suffocated my estate for the past 12 months was finally gone. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors of my home and stepped out onto the wide, wraparound porch. The morning air was sharp, crisp, and incredibly clean, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming flora. The sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the sprawling grounds. I walked slowly toward the edge of the wooden deck, my eyes settling on the antique rose garden that stretched out alongside the eastern perimeter of the property. The garden was a vibrant, sprawling tapestry of crimson, pale yellow, and deep velvet hues. It remained completely untouched by the malicious chaos that had recently threatened to consume our lives. My wife had planted those specific rose bushes by hand over 3 decades ago. She had meticulously cultivated the soil, fiercely protecting the fragile roots through harsh winters and blistering summers. When the bank had threatened to seize our first tiny, dilapidated home during the early, desperate years of building my logistics company, she had simply gone outside and planted another row of roses, an absolute declaration of her unshakable faith in our survival. She believed that life required constant, deliberate cultivation, and she refused to let external threats dictate the beauty of her immediate surroundings. I looked at the thick, thorny stems and the brilliant velvet petals catching the early morning dew. The predators who had attempted to invade this sanctuary were gone, entirely neutralized by the very same relentless determination that had built this fortress in the first place. The Pierce family was currently navigating the brutal reality of federal holding cells and total bankruptcy, entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance they had weaponized against us. Their desperate, pathetic attempts to steal my life's work had completely failed, leaving my estate absolutely secure. I stood on the porch, taking a deep, unhurried breath. The air tasted like absolute freedom. The heavy armor I had been forced to wear, the constant, exhausting vigilance required to anticipate Logan's every manipulative strike was finally stripped away. I felt physically lighter, as if a literal crushing weight had been surgically removed from my chest. The sanctuary of my home was restored. I walked down the wooden steps and picked up the heavy galvanized steel watering can resting near the garden hose. The cool metal felt familiar and grounding against my calloused palm. I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that no one would ever threaten my family, my personal dignity, or my hard-earned legacy ever again. The brutal, devastating lesson I had delivered to the Pierce dynasty would serve as a permanent, undeniable warning to any other parasite looking for an easy mark. I filled the can and moved among the vibrant bushes, tilting the spout to nourish the deep roots. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who has absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. I had faced the absolute worst of high society greed and systematically crushed it with the raw, uncompromising grit of the working class. I pruned a few dead leaves, my fingers expertly avoiding the sharp thorns, ensuring the vibrant blossoms had the space they needed to thrive. I was no longer fighting for survival. I was simply maintaining the beautiful, secure reality I had actively secured for my daughter. I set the watering can down and walked back up the wooden steps to the porch. I took my seat in the heavy, weathered rocking chair facing the eastern sunrise. Beside me, resting on a small side table, was a steaming mug of black coffee. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, letting the rich, bitter aroma fill my senses. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes scanning the quiet, secure perimeter of my property. The profound silence encompassing the estate was no longer the heavy, burdensome quiet of a looming ambush. It was not the suffocating, tense atmosphere that had choked the life out of this house while Logan manipulated my daughter and plotted my financial execution. Instead, the quiet was deeply comforting. It was the profound, unshakable peace of absolute victory. The chaotic noise of deceit, the frantic scrambling of desperate thieves, and the agonizing heartbreak of betrayal had been entirely silenced. Naomi was safe, fully awakened to her own undeniable strength, and actively building a secure, independent future completely free of toxic attachments. My empire remained solidly under my control, completely untainted by the hands of entitled predators. I leaned back in the wooden rocker, listening to the gentle creak of the floorboards and the soft rustle of the wind moving through the antique roses. The long, grueling war was officially over. I had protected my blood, defended my life's work, and completely eradicated the infection that had threatened to destroy everything I loved. I took another slow drink of the dark coffee, looking out over the flourishing grounds of my home. The storm had passed, the foundation had held, and absolute order was finally fully restored. Did you enjoy this story of calculated justice and unyielding strength? Which part of Lawrence and Naomi's master plan was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more thrilling life stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner power. See you in the next story, with love and respect.